Monday, the 5th of April 1993. The three of us clung to the top of the Bradley armoured fighting vehicle as it lurched over the churned-up ground. My right hand was clenched round an ice-cold grab handle near the turret. My left gripped the shoulder strap of my day sack. We'd flown 3,000 miles to use this gear, and there was nothing to replace it if it got damaged. Our Bradley was the only one of the 4 AFVs carrying an SAS team, but night sun searchlights were mounted on all 4 and were strafing the front of the target buildings. Charlie, our team leader, gave Half-Arse and me the shout to stand by. Seconds later, our AFV slowed, then came to a halt. We scrambled down the sides, taking care our day sacks didn't strike anything on the way. The vehicle swiveled on its axis, mud cascading from its tracks, and headed back the way we'd come. I joined Charlie and Half-Arse behind a couple of cars, and we hugged the ground, looking, listening, tuning in. Our AFV was now grinding along the other side of the building with its mates, night suns working the front of the target. And now they were a safe distance from our eardrums. The loudspeakers mounted on each vehicle began broadcasting a horrible, high-pitched noise, like baby rabbits being slaughtered. They'd been doing that for days. I didn't know how it was affecting the people inside the target, but it certainly made me crazy. We were about 50 metres from the rear of the target. I checked Baby G. About 6 hours till first light. I checked the gaffer tape holding my earpiece and that the 2 throat mic sensors were still in place. Charlie thumbed the Pressel hanging from his black corduroy bomber jacket. "This is Team Alpha. We clear to move yet? Over." He was talking to a P-3 aircraft circling some 25,000 feet above our heads. Bristling with thermal imaging equipment to warn us of any impending threat while we were on the job, it also carried an immensely powerful infrared torch. I checked that my 1-inch square of luminous tape was still stuck on my shoulder. The aircraft's infrared beam was invisible to the naked eye, but the reflection off our squares would stick out like sore thumbs on their camera. If we were compromised and bodies poured out of the target to take us on, at least P3 would be able to direct the quick reaction force to the right place. The reply from the P3 came to my earpiece too. "Yep, that's a free zone, Team Alpha, free zone." Charlie gave 2 clicks on the Pressel and began to crawl. He'd know that I was second in line, with Half-Arse bringing up the rear. Half-Arse was going to be the eyes and ears, while Charlie and I worked on target. The crawl was wet and muddy, and my jeans and fleece were quickly soaked. 6 minutes later, we were where we needed to be, a point between 2 ground floor windows. A utility box the size of a coal bunker was set against the wall. It was an ideal location for the stuff we were going to leave behind. Fingers shielding the lens of his mini maglite, Charlie opened the utility box and had a quick look inside. Half-Arse had his pistol out. He kept his eyes on the windows and his ears everywhere else. He'd had a buttock shot away during an op a few years back, and right now I wondered if it meant his arse was only half as cold as mine. We knew that everyone in tactical operations in the various pods would be watching the thermal and IR imagery of us at work beamed down to them by the P3. Charlie had worked out where he wanted to fix the device. He pressed a thumbnail into the wood at almost ground level and gave me a nod. I eased the day sack off my back and brought out a pyramid 7 inches high and made of alloy. Instead of a peak, it had a hole, and at each of the 4 corners was a fixing lug. Guided by the beam from Charlie's maglite, I positioned the pyramid so the hole was directly over his nail mark and held it there while he put a battery-powered screwdriver to the first lug. Very slowly, very deliberately, with all the precision of a neurosurgeon, he proceeded to insert a listening device into the wall of the target building. It took over an hour of painstaking effort before Charlie was ready to connect the microphone to the lithium battery and lay a metre-long wire antenna on the ground. As soon as the power was switched on, I could hear the microphone rustling in my earpiece. Then I heard a woman murmuring to her children and a man moan in agony. It must have been the one who'd taken a round in the stomach during the first attack. Charlie closed and relocked the utilities box as I dug the wire into the earth and smoothed it over. As we started to crawl back to the Bradley, voices echoed in my earpiece. A man mumbled passages from the Bible. A child whimpered and pleaded for a drink of water. We'd done our bit. Now it was time to hand our toys over to the Americans. 2 weeks later, and the 100-odd men, women and children in the target were still on the receiving end of the relentless screaming, like babies being slaughtered, taped on a loop and amplified 1,000 times through the AFV's loudspeakers. I unzipped my sleeping bag, slid my arm out into the cold and pressed the illumination button on Baby G. It was 5:38 a.m. I kicked the bag next to me. Day 51 of the siege. Welcome to another day in paradise. Anthony stirred. They're still playing the same bloody record. He groaned as he adjusted position. Tony wasn't used to sleeping hard. He belonged in a freshly starched white coat back at his lab, and he wasn't at all happy about what was happening here. Once we'd fixed the listening devices, nobody was interested in the Brits who'd been sent to Waco to observe and advise. Charlie and Half-Arse had flown back to the UK. I'd been told to stay and keep an eye on Tony. The Americans might still want to use the box of tricks he'd brought along. I looked through one of the bullet holes in the side of our cattle trailer. AFVs were circling the target buildings like Indians around a wagon train, night suns bouncing wildly. The compound, as the feds were calling the Branch Davidians' hangout, comprised a mishmash of wooden-framed buildings, 2 large 3-story blocks, and a large rectangular water tower. All of a sudden, the ear-piercing, gut-wrenching screams stopped. The silence was deafening. Then one of 3 or 4 AFVs clustered together near the car park lurched forward, ploughed through the fence, and kept straight on. I gave Tony another nudge. Look at this. They're crushing all the cars and buses. As soon as the last vehicle was flattened, the AFVs spread out and the animals' screams boomed out again from their loudspeakers. People were on the move outside our trailer, making their way to and from the array of shower cubicles, toilets and food wagons that had sprung up on our patch of the 77-acre tented city. There was no shortage of bodies to be catered for. The place was teeming. No fewer than 4 pods were sprinkled around the compound, Alpha Pod right next to our trailer. What's more, a rock festival-sized audience was gathering. Hordes of vehicles lined the road the far side of the cordon. The rubberneckers were coming from miles around for a good day out. There was even a funfair. David Koresh and his fellow Bible bashers couldn't have known what they were letting themselves in for when they resisted the original attack by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms almost 2 months ago. Tony was one of the 9,000 or so eggheads employed by DERA, the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency. You didn't ask these guys exactly which of the 80 or so establishments up and down the UK they worked, but I was pretty sure he wouldn't be a complete stranger to the germ warfare laboratories at Porton Down in Wiltshire. The RAF had flown a big container in with us, and Tony carried the keys. The FBI had been pretty keen to have access to Charlie's siege surveillance devices, but the inside of Tony's head was what they really wanted. A flurry of shouted instructions belted out of Alpha Pod's command tent. Special Agent Jim D. Bastendorf, call me Buster, was tuning up for his morning gobbing-off session to the new shift commanders. It had taken us no time at all to christen Bastendorf Deaf Bastard, then Bastard for short. Bastard was a Texan, which meant that everything, and most of all his stomach, was bigger than it needed to be. And, yes sirree, Jim D. Bastendorf knew exactly what his mission was, to kick ass, bust heads, solve the problem. As for Tony and me, he didn't have a clue what we were doing here. Suddenly, something was happening. "Shut the fuck up!" boomed Bastard. "It's showtime!" Bastard had thrown a switch so that his mates could listen in on the conversation between the negotiators and the Bible bashers. A child of no more than 5 was on the phone inside the compound. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked. The negotiator was on a US Air Force base miles away. He spoke gently as Bastard's boys in the command tent shrieked and whistled. "No, honey, No one's coming to kill you."
"You sure? The tanks are still outside."
"The tanks won't hurt you, honey." I exchanged a glance with Tony. Whatever the negotiator said, it didn't look good for Koresh and his crew. Weeks before, the ATF had ignored Koresh's invitation to inspect the place for whatever they thought the Davidians had up their sleeves. Instead, they'd mounted a full-scale armed operation. In Washington right now, it was budget time. The ATF, under some pressure to justify their existence, clearly wanted to put on a bit of a display. They'd invited the media along. They'd even got their own cameras rolling in case the news hounds missed any of the action. The Branch Davidians must have known something was up when they'd clocked the film crews setting up shop. Then helicopters started swooping round the rear of the compound, while cattle trailers full of armed ATF agents headed for the front door. The Davidians had returned fire, as they were entitled to under American law. They'd even called 911 to tell the police they were being attacked and begged for help. The gun battle had lasted for an hour. At the end of it, 4 ATF agents lay dead, with another 16 wounded. Then the FBI took over. From that moment, the Branch Davidians were doomed. As for me, I didn't particularly care which way this thing panned out. I was out of the regiment in a couple of months' time. A few weeks back, a job looking after oil men and rigs in Algeria had come up. The wages were 3 times what I was on. As I had only 5 years left with the regiment anyway, whether I liked it or not, there wasn't much thinking involved. Why not stand on my own 2 feet now? I handed in my notice. A week later, I was approached by the firm. I still wasn't sure why, but it didn't matter. It meant not having to fill in tax forms or pay rent, and I'd find out what they wanted me for soon enough. Suddenly, a series of loud crashes came from the compound, then a voice from inside. "You're attacking the children! What about the children?" The negotiator went straight into monotone. "Do not open fire. This is not an assault. We will not be entering the building. I repeat, do not open fire. This is not an assault." Almost at once, the loudspeakers on the armoured vehicles began. "This standoff is over. Do not fire any weapons. This is not an assault. Do not fire any weapons." Tony and I ran to the back of the cattle trailer. 3 CEVs, combat engineer vehicles, tracked armoured monsters with big battering rams out in front, were rumbling around the compound. One pushed straight through the wall like a finger through wet paper. Another forced its ram into the far corner of the building and stopped. The searchlights were dancing like dervishes as the 3rd CEV half disappeared through a wall. "This is not an attack," barked the loudspeakers. "Do not open fire." "If this isn't an attack," said Tony, "then what the hell is it?" He scrambled over the trailer gate, hit the ground, and started running towards Alpha Pod. I followed. The structure was kept upright by air forced through inflatable tubes in the frames. A generator chugged away just outside. This being an American command post, there was also air conditioning. Every table was groaning with TV monitors and computers. Cables trailed across the floor. Everyone had their eyes glued to the screens. The monitors showed all elevations of the target. 2 displayed aerial views from P3 cameras still circling at 25,000 feet. The infrared and thermal images looked like black and white negatives. Bright white light showed the heat coming from the CEV's exhaust, then white flames as the driver changed gear before ramming into the rear of the building. 30 seconds later, the vehicle reversed. "Hey, Koresh! How you like that new air freshener? Y'all find that tank's ass stinks more than ours." I looked at Tony. Gas. The FBI's patience had run out. They'd gas them and then round them up as they staggered out, coughing and spluttering, fluids dribbling from every orifice. I grinned at Tony. "Good news. That's you and me on a plane home." But Tony wasn't smiling. He strode up to Bastard. "What gas are you using?" Bastard, staring at the screen, shrugged. Tony pointed to the monitors as another CEV crashed into the compound. "Have they got respirators in there? What about the children? In those confined spaces, you're going to kill them. Why aren't they already coming out?" Bastard ignored him. Outside, the symphony of slaughtered animals returned, and another CEV embedded itself in the building. It stayed put for about 20 seconds and then pulled out. Another mosquito injecting its poison. Bastard stood glued to the screens. Tony grabbed his shoulder and spun him round, so their faces were only inches apart.
"This is going to kill them. Do you understand? They're all going to die."
I scanned the perimeter, and the penny dropped. Where were the ambulances to treat the casualties? Where were the reception parties to process the prisoners? Where were the wagons to take them away? Why were all these guys watching the attack rather than being part of it? Bastard had reached breaking point.
"Well, chew on this, fag. It's your goddamn gas, so I guess that makes you an accessory."
Tony stepped back, stunned. Bastard revelled in the sight.
"Kinda catches in the back of your throat, don't it? Now get the fuck out of here, faggot! What the fuck you Brits doing here anyway?"
Bastard lifted his spade-sized right hand and pushed against Tony's face. He reeled back and toppled onto one of the radio operators. The command tent fell silent, and the rabbits and the rumble of the CEVs filled the space. I took 3 quick strides and got in between them. "I'll take him away. I'm sorry, he's not used to seeing this sort of thing. I'll get him out of the way for you." I guided Tony out of the tent, but he didn't come willingly.
"They're going to die in there, Nick. They won't be coming out. Some of the children are probably dead already. We must stop it. This is madness."
I looked at him.
"We're not going to stop anything, mate. There's an agenda. They want the fuckers dead."
His jaw dropped. Tony didn't share the Rambo mindset of those in the helicopters and tanks. He invented toys for them to play with, but I could see he wasn't used to joining in the game.
"But it's women and children in there. They're killing them. Someone must do something."
I put my hand on his shoulder.
"Listen, ever since this thing kicked off, Koresh and the rest of them have been made to sound like the devil's disciples. Think of it in Bastard's terms. It's a black and white world, and these are the bad guys."
By 11 o'clock, it was getting pretty hot on my vantage point on top of the cattle trailer. I took off my jacket and pulled up the sleeves of my sweatshirt. Still, no one had come out of the buildings. I could only think that they'd all been killed by the gas, had killed themselves rather than surrender, or were being kept inside by Koresh. I wondered what had been going on round the back. I hadn't seen anything, but I knew automatic gunfire when I heard it. Our guys, their guys, or both, who knew? The police and federal marshals' day shift had clocked on hours ago, but the overnight guys had hung around to watch the finale. They were getting a little bored now. If Tony was right, most of the Davidians were dead, so why weren't the FBI masking up teams and sending them in to look for survivors? Just then a shout went up from one of the vehicles.
"Fire! Fire!"
I grabbed Tony. "Get the kit together, we're fucking off." 4 or 5 columns of smoke started to rise from the compound as we ran. Even if there had been a fire crew in place, the combination of the heat of the day, the wind, and the gas made the chances of putting it out next to zero. As if on cue, a policeman jumped down from his wagon, ran a few metres towards the compound, then turned back to face the crowd. He unfurled an ATF flag.
"Let the fuckers burn!"
He waved the flag, and scores of men hooted and hollered. In the background, I heard a barrel organ. The fairground was sparking up. Noosa, Queensland, Thursday the 21st of April 2005. I leaned forward to suck up the last of my milkshake. No one at the Surfers Club seemed to mind the gurgling noise. They were too busy surfing and turfing their way through the kind of mammoth lunches Silky and I had just put away. While I waited for her to come back with a couple of ice creams, I sat back to admire the view. Sun, sea, sand, and behind me thousands of miles of bush. Coming here had definitely been the right call. Silky returned with 2 cones already dripping down her hands. She licked her hand and sat down. She came from Berlin. I'd known her a month,
and her accent still reminded me of the black and white war films I used to watch as a kid. "I've just been watching George Bush on TV." She hooked her shoulder-length blonde hair behind her ear. "He says Iran and Syria are next. What is the matter with the man? I've been to Syria. They're nice people." "Your fault for watching TV," I said. "I don't even read the newspapers now. It's all bullshit. And when you've got a view like that—" I nodded in the direction of the incoming waves. "What more do you need?" Her blue eyes speared me over the top of her sunglasses. "After last night, you still have to ask this?" I grinned. "The ocean will still be here tomorrow, but will Silky? One can never tell with you hippies." I was rewarded with a dangerously arched eyebrow. "Bush can live his dream," I said. "I'll have mine." And I did. Bumming round Australia in a camper van, free-fall rig in the back, a backpacker along for the ride. The only bit of pressure each day was deciding whether to risk looking like a dickhead on a surfboard or to do something I was pretty good at, like jumping out of aeroplanes. Only dress code, t-shirt, shorts and flip-flops, and the collection of friendship bracelets I'd accumulated over the last few months around my wrist. Money wasn't a problem. When I ran short, I just drove to another boogie, the inn name for a free-fall parachute meet, and packed rigs. Silky checked her watch. "Better get going if we're going to make it to your friends by tonight. The hippies never turn down the free bed." It was hot as an oven inside the 1980s box-shaped, mustard-coloured VW Combi. We chugged slowly out of the car park and through the busy streets of the little resort. It looked as if it had been around the planet a couple of times, and I hoped it wasn't going to throw in the towel before I got back to Sydney, cleaned the thick layers of bug kill off the windscreen, and sold it to some other sucker. We hit the highway south to Brisbane, and I was soon on autopilot, staring at the long straight ribbon of tarmac through the shimmering heat haze. Silky sorted out a cassette from the shoebox between us, and the Libertines were soon competing with the rush of wind through the side windows. Silky settled back in her seat, her sandaled feet resting on the dashboard. A few songs in, she turned to me and said, "We are good fit, no?" She was right. Coming to this place and meeting her had been one of the best things I'd ever done. It hadn't been a tough decision, binning George. I never got to find out which department of the CIA or the Pentagon he worked for. I just got up one morning, packed everything that I owned into 2 cheap holdalls and a day sack, and went to the office. I told George I'd had enough, and waited for one of his scathing replies. "I need you until you're killed or I find somebody better, and you aren't dead yet." But it didn't happen. Instead, I got, "Be gone by tomorrow, son." I'd met Silky at a boogie just outside Sydney. She was in her late 20s and had been travelling for the last 6 or 7 years, working the bars, fruit-picking, hitching rides. It had started as a gap year, then she'd forgotten to go home. She hitched a ride north with me. Why not? It was only a few extra 1,000 miles in the magical mystery tour that she called her life. 4 hours and 1 petrol stop later, and we were approaching a small town that sounded more like a tongue-twister than a place on the map. The instructions Charlie had emailed me took us past a store with a tin roof, and we took the track left immediately after a blue letterbox at the roadside. We turned a corner or two, and a water tower started to take shape through the heat haze. We'd arrived at Charlie's farm. Well, his son-in-law's, but all the family had chipped in. They'd sold their houses and moved over to Australia lock, stock and barrel. About 100 metres from the house, a woman on a horse, waving like a lunatic, overtook us. I slowed, but she waved us on. She stopped at a gate, and we carried on along the track. "Who was that?" said Silky. "Probably Julie, the daughter. The last time I saw her, she was about 17 with a face full of zits. That would have been a good 15 years ago." Charlie stood on the veranda to welcome us, a big man in a green T-shirt. Hazel came out and slipped an arm through her husband's, and they walked down the steps and out into the sun to greet us. Charlie was heading for 60, but still looked fit as a butcher's dog.
His ginger hair somehow added to the healthy outdoor look. He thrust out a hand. He certainly hadn't shrunk with age. He was still a good 2 or 3 inches taller than me, but his grip wasn't as strong as it once had been. "All right, lad. Glad you've come." I put an arm round Silky's shoulder and introduced her to them both. "My name's really Silka," she said, "but Nick calls me Silky. It's maybe easier if you do the same, otherwise you could confuse him." Hazel started to hustle us into the house. "Sure you can't stay more than a night?" "No, we've got to move on. There's a boogie in Melbourne on the 9th. A few minutes later, Charlie and I were alone. "While she's freshening up, lad," he said, "what does Silky know about work?" It was a question Charlie had to ask. He didn't want to put his foot in it. "Nothing. She thinks I'm a panel beater." "Did you tell her you're retired? She's obviously got a soft spot for the elderly." I returned his grin as Hazel came back into the living room with a tray of orange juice. She poured 3 glasses, and we clinked them in an unspoken toast. I pointed out of the window. "Was that Julie I saw riding?" Hazel's face lit up. "She'll be over soon. She phoned to say she'd seen you." "The pair of them. Like that they are." Charlie went to cross his fingers to show how entwined the two of them were, but couldn't quite manage it. His forefinger seemed to have a mind of its own. I looked at the family gallery on the sideboard, and my gaze fell on a photo of a young man in a light infantry beret and best-dressed number 2s. Stephen's passing out parade must have been about 1990, because Charlie and I had still been in the regiment. I'd thought he'd burst with pride when he told me. "How's your boy doing?" I asked. "He's still in?" Hazel looked at the floor. Charlie leant across and took her hand in his. "He was killed in Kosovo, 94. He just got promoted to corporal." I sat back, not sure what to say. "Don't worry about it, lad. You weren't to know." Silky drifted in, breaking the moment, smelling of soap and shampoo. She'd put on a pair of pale blue cotton trousers and a white vest, and her wet hair was brushed back. She came and sat next to me. Whatever she was about to say was drowned out by the blare of a car horn. Seconds later, a flurry of feet and young voices bomb-burst into the house, the door flew open, and 4 boys with sticky-up crew cuts and untanned skin ran into the room. The older 2, about 8 and 7, came up to me and thrust out their hands. "You're Nick, aren't you?" Their 2 little brothers ran back outside, and a moment later Julie and her husband Alan came in with the 2 younger kids. We made the right noises as we shook hands. Charlie took charge. "Right, I'd better get that barbecue lit, hadn't I? Who's coming to help me?" 2 hours later, everybody was stuffed full of chicken, steak, prawns, and tuies. Silky sat with Julie and Hazel on the settee. Conversation flowed like they'd known each other all their lives. Alan sorted out a DVD for the kids, and, maybe sensing Charlie and I could do with some private time, sat down to watch it with them. "So," said Charlie, "you want to come and watch the sun go down, or what?" He couldn't have made it more obvious that he had something he wanted to talk about. He lifted 2 new cans, and I followed him out onto the veranda. Charlie sat on a bench and motioned me to a swing seat opposite. Whatever was on his mind, he didn't seem ready to talk about it yet. My eyes followed his to the horse grazing on its own in a corner. "You know what, Charlie? You were the one that I picked. I never told you that, did I?" The training major always gave just one piece of advice to the newly badged troopers. "When you get to your squadron, shut up, look and listen. Then pick one man you think is the ideal SAS soldier and watch and learn. There'll be times on operations when you don't know how to act or react. That's when you ask yourself what your man would do." Charlie had started out as the one I picked, and very quickly I could honestly say that I'd have followed him anywhere. He took a swig and rested his can on the rail. "I know, lad. I used to see you watching me. You learn much?" "I think I did." In fact, I thought about you on the last day of that Waco job. Do I deck that bastard bloke or not? I know I made the right decision. I'm not sure everybody at Waco did. Charlie turned his head to look at me. Remember that lad from Deera, the gas man? He killed himself a year later. I hadn't heard. I'd left the regiment by then. His name was Anthony. He was all right. Good men, fucked over by the system. It's nothing new. He took another swig of beer and looked me square in the eye. Coming here was the worst thing I could have done, lad. Far too much time on my hands. People look at me and think I have a slice of paradise, but it's driving me fucking mad. If you keep moving, keep doing, there's no time left to think. But now I spend half the day thinking about Stephen. Next morning I sat next to Silky on the veranda as the sun came up, cutting orange after orange for her to squeeze and tip into a jug. Getting the Tyndalls breakfast seemed the least we could do to repay their hospitality. Hazel appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were red and shiny. Silky jumped to her feet. "Hazel, are you all right?" A tear rolled down her cheek. "He's gone." "Gone?" I said. "What are you on about?" "He's not here." I glanced around at the parking area at the side of the house. The Land Cruiser was missing. "You sure he hasn't left a note or something?" She shook her head. "I'm scared that something's happened, Nick. He wasn't himself when he came to bed. You sure he didn't say anything?" The telephone began ringing. Hazel was already moving. I started through the door, but Hazel was already on her way back. "That was Julie. The Land Cruiser's at the station. What's happening, Nick?" She buried her face in the front of my shirt and clung to me like a drowning man. At last she raised her head. "Please, help me find him, Nick. Please." The filing cabinet in Charlie's office had 4 drawers. I opened the bottom one, P to Z, and pulled out the folder marked T and scrutinised the phone bills for the last couple of quarters. It didn't take long to spot a pattern. Over the last month or so, and with increasing frequency, there had been several long calls to an 01432 number in the UK. I looked at my watch. It was just after 9 a.m, so still well before bedtime back home. I picked up the phone and dialed. A finger prodded me in the shoulder. "You wanted to know when we got to Hereford." I opened my eyes and thanked the old lady opposite. Then, feeling like a zombie, I got off the train. Too many time zones were against me. My conscience was weighing pretty heavily too. I felt bad about lying to Silky. Going to the station to see if he's left anything in the wagon was hardly the same as, "I've spoken to the broker, and it sounds like Charlie's accepted a job offer somewhere, so I'm flying halfway across the world to find out more." Lying wouldn't go down well, of course, but Hazel would explain, and I'd make it up to her somehow when I got back, if she was still there. I wandered out to the taxi rank and asked for Bobblestock. "I can't remember the name of the road, but I'll show you where it is when we get there." I spotted a new pub and a couple of shops that hadn't been there long, but otherwise Hereford was exactly as I remembered it. I'd left the regiment in 1993, and I'd never been back since. Crazy Dave lived on the high ground of Bobblestock. "Just here, mate." We stopped outside a brick rectangle with a garage extension that looked as if it had been assembled from a flat pack. Crazy Dave had been in Boat Troop A Squadron. Being as straight as a die made him perfect for his new job. Discretion was everything. When I'd asked him about Charlie over the phone, he'd admitted the old fucker was on the books, but wouldn't give me any wheres or whens. He did invite me round for a brew, though, any time I wanted to chat. So, well, here I was. I rang the bell, and the door was opened almost at once by 2 guys on their way out. They looked young and fit, obviously either having just left the regiment or being about to. I closed the door behind me. The staircase was fitted with one of those stair lifts that Thora Hird used to flog in the Sunday supplements. Dave's voice came from down to the right somewhere.
"Straight through, mate. Out the back. I'm in the garage."
I crossed a small square of lawn to where a ramp led up to a pair of doors set into the garage wall. The garage had been converted into an office. Crazy Dave was sitting behind his desk. He didn't get up. He couldn't. I went over and shook his hand.
"What the fuck did you do to yourself?"
Crazy Dave wheeled his way round in front of me in a very high-tech aluminium go-faster chair.
"Not what you think. Got bounced off my Suzuki on the M4 by a truck driver from Estonia. 6 months in Stoke Mandeville. So that was me out of the regiment. I get a disability pension, but it hardly keeps me in haircuts. Then this landed on my plate. Madness not to take it."
There'd always been a broker knocking around Hereford. He had to be ex-regiment because he had to know the people. "How's it all work, Dave? I've never been to a broker."
"Guys contact me. I bang their details down on a card and put them into the box marked standby. See the other box? That's for bayonets, the boys who are actually working. So, what do you want to know about Charlie?"
"He's a dinosaur, Dave. Far too old to be fucking about. Hazel wants him home. Can you give me some idea where he's gone?"
Dave smiled. "I can't tell you anything, mate. That's the deal with the companies. They don't want anybody knowing what jobs they got going, and if everybody went home as soon as their wives started honking, there'd be hardly any fucker working. Sorry." He wheeled himself off towards the door. "I'm going for a dump. I've been trying to put a toilet in here, but planning won't let me, the bastards."
I followed as he whistled through the French windows and down the ramp.
"Wait in the front room. What about a pint later?"
Selecting a key from his bunch, he locked the garage doors. Then we went into the living room. He carried on to the bottom of the stairs and transferred himself onto the stair lift. He selected another key from his bunch, pushed it into a control box on the wall and gave it a turn. The chair glided slowly upwards. The moment I heard the bathroom door close, I went to the control box, grabbed the bunch of keys and headed for the garage. Charlie's card was right at the front of the bayonets box. It gave no details, except that Dave had booked him a hotel room in Istanbul. Istanbul, Thursday the 28th of April. A drive swept along the front of the Barcelo Eresin Topkapi Hotel, a large 4-story building that wouldn't have been out of place along the Croisette in Cannes. A huge banner over the entrance welcomed the architects of Germany to their conference. I paid the cab driver and headed through a pair of towering glass automatic doors into the lobby. 3 or 4 blonde girls were clustered on a portable exhibition stand to the right of reception. I kept walking, looking as if I knew where I was going, till I came to the telephones. The operator spoke better English than I did. "Listen," I said. "The Architects' Conference. I'm the English-speaking organiser in reception, and a Mr. Charles Tyndall has gone up without his welcome pack. Could you possibly put me through to him?" I flicked through my imaginary notepad. "He's in... I can't read this writing." "Mr. Tyndall is in 317. Don't bother. Here he is right now. Thank you very much for your help. Mr. Tyndall, here's your..." I put the phone down, and seconds later was pressing the button for the lift. When Charlie opened the door, I wasn't too sure if his expression was surprise or anger. "Don't tell me. You were just passing." "Had to get my finger out and find you, didn't I?" "You spoken to Hazel yet?" "You're joking. I emailed, said I'm fine and I'll call later." As I sat on the bed, he opened the minibar under the TV and brought out 2 cans of Carlsberg. He passed one to me. "Look," I said, "I don't want to know the job, mate, but if you're serious about working, you could do much better than here. What about Baghdad or even Kabul? The money's better." Charlie took a long swig of Carlsberg. 3 days' work here, and all my problems are sorted." "Sorted? What the fuck are you on about? You're already sorted. You're living the dream." "Hazel's dream." He sighed. "Look, I'm happy to go along with it. Since Stephen died, the only thing that's kept her sane is having the whole family around her. But a farm don't run on horse shit. The pension only just about pays the mortgage. This job will pay off the debts in one swoop and then some."
The high sweat-to-bread ratio sounded worrying. It normally signalled a job no one else wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole. "How much?" He smiled.
"It's a one-off. Special senior citizen rates. 200,000 US.
"Fuck me. You dropping Putin or something? Charlie, you're too old for this shit. Go home. Make Hazel happy. Let me get back to my German."
"It's not just about the money, lad."
He stared at me for a long time, searching for the right words. He looked down at his hand, which was trembling, then back at me. I finally twigged. "You're sick."
"I'm dying." I was so tired I wondered if I'd heard right.
"What the fuck's wrong with you?" He looked out of the window.
MND, motor neurone disease. Well, one of the forms of it. A few Yanks who are in the Gulf have got it as well. They're trying to find a connection. By the time they do, it'll be too fucking late."
He took a swig of beer and held the can out towards me.
"It's started. Sometimes I have to concentrate real hard just to pull the ring on one of these things. But I want it kept mum, at least until all the money's in the bank. I want something to cushion the blow for Hazel when I tell her."
"But what if your hands start disco dancing while you're working?"
"Chance I've got to take."
"Crazy Dave, no?" Charlie shrugged.
"Crazy Dave's not in the charity game. I just told him how much cash I needed and said if there was a job that paid it, I'd be there."
"What if you fuck up and don't get home? That'll be 2 that Hazel's lost." He stood up.
"She's going to lose me whatever I do. This way at least she gets some compensation."
He fixed his eyes on mine.
"You want to come along as shotgun? No pay, mind, that's all for Hazel. But I'll pick up the costs and get you back to your German club class."
"But you haven't even told me the job." Charlie fished a USB memory stick out of his jeans and plugged it into his laptop, which was sitting on the desk next to the TV, lit up, screen working. He tapped the keyboard, and we got a jerky picture of a 10-foot brick wall with broken glass cemented into its top. Every window was protected by a heavy grille. The camera passed the graffiti-sprayed gates. 2 wall-high metal plates closed the house off to the public and were held together by a lever lock.
"This, my lad, is the home of a government minister in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He goes by the name of Zurab Bazgadze, though I like to think of him as plain old Baz."
"Great. And?"
"I'm going to pop in there and do a little job."
"No job's that little for that sort of cash. You covering your back?" He grinned.
"That's why I'm thinking you should come along and help me."
He walked over to his carry-on and extracted a small digital camcorder. Its red light glowed.
"I thought it was him at the door again."
He powered down the device.
"I'm building up as much of a security blanket I can lay my hands on. If I get stitched up, he'll go down with me."
"Who are you on about?"
"The world's fattest American, with one of those white wall haircuts."
Charlie came back to join me at the laptop. He pulled out the memory stick and waved it at me before it disappeared into his pocket.
"He dropped this off, and the laptop, and before you ask, don't."
He was right. I didn't need to know who this man was. "I'm more worried about you getting caught. Those shaky old hands of yours will see out their days with thumbscrews attached to them. They don't fuck about in Georgia, mate."
"Piece of piss getting into that target, lad. Who do you think did all those banks in Bosnia?"
"I thought about you when I read the story." Towards the end of the Bosnian War, the firm needed to get their hands on the financial records of certain government officials and high-ranking army officers who were taking bribes from the drug and prostitution barons. MOE guys from the regiment hit a whole lot of banks. The idea was that when the new country was formed, we could make sure we kept the dodgy ones out of the picture and got the good guys in. Not that it had worked, of course. It never does.
"What is this little job you're doing, then?"
The screen went blank.
"Can't tell you just yet. But come along as shotgun, and I'll tell you in country. I've got to hit the place this Saturday, leaving here at dark o'clock tonight. Why Saturday? Baz is away, but he'll be back Sunday, so it's make your mind up time, lad. He raised an eyebrow, waiting for a reply. Tell you what, Charlie, I said. You call Hazel and tell her you're okay and I'm here, and I'll think about it. Tbilisi, Georgia, Saturday the 30th of April. My sleep was broken by an announcement from the flight deck I didn't understand a word of, and the plane began its descent. I looked out of the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the city, but the cloud cover was too low and it was still pitch dark. Baby G told me it was nearly 5:30 a.m. I just loved red-eye flights. They really set you up for a good day out. I dug around in the seat pocket for the printouts I'd done at the Internet Cafe in Istanbul. I'd had a day to kill after Charlie had left the city, and I always tried to find out as much as I could about any alien environment I was about to go into. Apart from anything else, if I had to get out quick time, I'd need all the help I could get. I tended to hit the CIA's World Report website for facts and figures and backpacker chat rooms for real-time information. It paid to get the view from both ends of the food chain. If I needed more, I'd log on to Google. The Russian Federation, referred to in the local press as the aggressive neighbour, loomed over Georgia to the north, and the two weren't exactly cozying up at the moment. Since the fall of communism, Georgia, always a predominantly Christian country, had become an independent state, very pro-West, very pro-Bush. Pro-Bush meant anti-Putin, whichever way you looked at it, and that definitely put the main man at the Kremlin's nose out of joint. What pissed him off even more was the fact that America and the UK had already given millions of dollars in arms and equipment to the Georgian military. It was the last thing he wanted happening in his backyard, which was why he hadn't pulled out his troops, armour and artillery, officially still there as peacekeepers. To the east lay Azerbaijan, one of the countries lucky enough to have a shoreline bordering the oil-rich Caspian Sea. Despite being Muslim, it too was backed big time by the US, for reasons that weren't hard to see. The BTC pipeline, built by a consortium headed by BP and on the brink of coming online, stretched 1,000 miles from Baku and passed just south of Tbilisi as it made its way through Georgia towards the Mediterranean coast. To the southwest was Armenia, a country I'd always reckoned must be completely devoid of any men between the ages of 20 and 40. They were all busy elsewhere, running drugs, prostitution and extortion in every city in the West, as well as every other racket that used to be mafia copyright until these guys muscled in. Also to the southwest lay the all-important Turkey, feeling pretty pleased with itself these days for owning the business end of the pipeline, where fleets of supertankers would soon be waiting to ferry enough of the black stuff to keep the 4x4s of the UK and the east coast of America on the road for the foreseeable future. The US and Brits were heading what was called the Partnership for Peace programme. In theory, rebuilding Georgia's post-communist army, but in practice, training them to protect the energy corridor. The threat of sabotage by Islamic militants and ethnic separatists was constant. The funniest thing I read was that the Russians had gone and built a base alongside each of the US ones, so the two sides just sat there, eyeballing each other. The plane touched down, and I followed the other punters across the rain-lashed tarmac to the Soviet regime's idea of a state-of-the-art terminal building, a mausoleum of concrete and glass. A whacking $120 secured me the necessary visa from a guy at the immigration desk. If I'd had the time to queue all day at the consulate in Istanbul, it would have cost me $40. And half an hour later, my cab was pulling up at the Marriott Hotel, which looked every bit as big and impersonal as any I'd stayed in. 316, sir. The concierge handed me my room card. I thanked him and turned away, but he hadn't finished. 1 moment. He searched under the counter. This is for you. I took the bulky envelope. On the back was written, "From CT." Escorted to my room by a highly groomed bellboy speaking perfect American, I shut the door and peeled open Charlie's envelope. The pay-as-you-go mobile was fresh from its packaging. I sparked it up. There was only one phone number in the display, so I pressed it. Charlie answered immediately. "I'm in 316, I said. You?" 106. "Well, give me 30. See you then." I scanned the minibar. The normal miniatures, a local beer covered in paperclip writing and a bit of Russian, some Coke and fruit drinks. I settled for a can of paperclip apple juice and headed for the shower. I glanced outside as I went. It was a gloomy, cloud-ridden dawn. The street directly below me was the main drag, already clogged with Western cars and trucks and old square larders straining under the weight of sacks of spuds lashed onto their roof racks. Beyond it were a lot of grand buildings a couple of 100 years old. A few domes and church spires from even further back rubbed shoulders with the tightly packed brick squares that lined the narrow, steeply climbing streets. The green hills that surrounded the city soared above the rooftops and seemed close enough to reach out and touch. I put my fluorescent nylon socks over my hands, jumped into the shower, and used them as flannels to give both them and me a wash. 10 minutes later, I headed downstairs with money, passport, phone, and wet hair. Room 106 had a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door handle in Russian, English, and paperclip. I gave a knock, and a smiley Charlie let me in. He looked me up and down. "You look like those blocks of flats on the way in." The curtains were drawn, all the lights were on. The PC was rigged up at the small desk by the window. A town map was spread out on the bed. Alongside was a collection of improvised picks and tension wrenches. I sat on the edge of the mattress. "You already done the locks recce for this little job of yours?" "I could see everything from the video," he said, going over to the PC and pushing a memory stick into the USB port. "Have a look." He freeze-framed on a shot of large double steel gates. "See? Piece of piss. It'll take me about 10 seconds. "What happens when you're inside?" He flipped down the screen and looked at me. "It's a close target, recce. I have to open a safe and nick whatever documents are there, lock everything up again, and drop the stuff in a dead letterbox. Old Baz'll never know. We'll be in and out without leaving a fart print." "You know where the safe is? What sort?" "No, and it doesn't matter. Why do you think I'm being paid so much?" "Do you know what you're lifting?" "No, just anything inside the safe, handwritten or printed." "You know what this Baz guy has done, or what he's about to do?" Charlie knew I'd be hitting him with questions like this for hours if he didn't shut me up. "Take a breath, lad. I'll be finding out all I need to when old Whitewall turns up at 9. "What's he coming here for?" "I gave him a kit list in Istanbul." And, grinning like an idiot, Charlie went through it all. Fibre optic equipment, big hold-all of pick gear to cover all the safe options, all the other tiny details that never leave the expert's mind. He loved talking work. It was like he'd been let out of the paddock. "I know it's risky. That's why I want you to come." "What's this Baz's name again?" "Hang on. Baz Gadzi. But his name doesn't matter, does it?" I looked at Charlie. "You phoned Hazel. How was she?" He smiled. "A bit scratchy, but she knows you're with me. Silky was out riding with Julie." I realised I was smiling too. It had only been a few days, but I was missing her. Charlie knew he'd touched a nerve. "If you like, you can even get back into Hazel's good books by saying you're dragging me back." He thumbed the number into his cell. "Go on, give her a ring. She thinks we're still in Turkey, by the way. Tell her you're bringing me back tomorrow." The smile had gone. This was serious. I hit the call button. It got picked up after just one ring. "No," I said. "It's Nick." "When's your flight?" "Tomorrow. He's seen sense at last." "Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you, thank you." "Is Silky there?" I asked. I heard Hazel's muffled reply, then Silky's voice. "I'm missing you, Nick Stein. You're coming back tomorrow?" "Listen, we're on a cell. It's costing a bomb. I'll call you when we get a flight, okay?" "Okay." "And Silky?" "What?" "I miss you too, Boxhead." The sky was heavy and grey, and cars splashed their way through puddles the size of tennis courts. The pavement glistened round the bus stop where I sat waiting for Whitewall to show up. I was across the road from the hotel, keeping Trigger on the entrance. The plan was that I'd give Charlie early warning of any possible going in. In his room, the camcorder was rigged up to record the handover of Kit and Whitewall's replies to Charlie's questions. The tape would become a major part of our security blanket if the wheels did come off. 10 minutes went by. Just before 9 o'clock, a two-tone Mitsubishi Pajero 4x4, silver bottom, dark blue top, pulled up outside the hotel. It was 3 up. Even from this distance, I could see that the passenger in the rear was the size of a small tank. He waddled out onto the pavement, took a large, light-coloured bag from the boot, then disappeared through the glass doors. This felt like Whitewall. I hit my cell phone. Got a possible carrying 2 donkeys' worth. I crossed the road to get a better view of the 2 up front. They were straight from Thick Bouncers Central Casting. Mid-30s, lots of black leather, clean-shaven, bald-headed. I felt the phone vibrate in my jeans pocket. I got out of line of sight and hit the green. "He's on his way down, lad. See you in 10. Charlie, already gloved up, took the tape out of the camcorder. The CTR kit was laid out on the bed alongside a navy blue canvas satchel the size of Imelda Marcos's shoe bag. I took a pair of rubber gloves from the bed and put them on. If Whitewall or his slapheads had left DNA or prints on the kit, that was up to them, but I wanted it sterile of Charlie and me. "Come on then, old man. How did it go?" I told him I wouldn't do the job unless I knew what was happening. So he talked me through it while I gloved up and pulled out the bits of kit one by one in front of him. There was everything a budding burglar could wish for, from lockpicks, rakes and tension wrenches to mini mag lights, a keyring torch and rubber door wedges. But there was one particular bit of kit missing. "Where's the weapon, mate?" "Not needed. Like I said, in and out. Seems our man Baz has got his grubby little fingers in just about every pie within reach. He's in with the militants up north, and he's taking backhanders from the Russians. Both of them want to sabotage the pipeline, and that puts the lives of Yank and Brit construction workers at risk. Whitewall wants to knock all that firmly on the head, but first he needs to know what Baz has got tucked away in that safe of his. You know, who's on the take, who's got the Semtex hidden under their bed. Once he's got all that in his hot little hand, the appropriate authorities can swing into action, and bingo, everyone can have a love fest." He turned and looked me in the eye. "Now, you happy with that? You can see the tape if you want." I shook my head. "No need. What's the plan?" "Whitewall says Baz will be out of the house until Sunday morning, so we go in as soon as we like this evening and catch the morning flight." "What about the dead letter box? Where are we dropping the stuff?" He'd forgotten about the DLB, I could see it. "Didn't I tell you? A cemetery about 10 minutes from the house. Whatever we find goes into a plastic bag and inside a stone bench next to someone called Tengiz. It's no problem. He's buried just past the main gate." I did up my jacket. "Tell you what, Charlie, why don't I go and do my walk past now? We'll RV in the cemetery and find this DLB. Then we'll split and come back here for the brief." End of Disc 1. Disc 2. I came out of the hotel and turned right along the main drag, checking the town map I'd got from the front desk. Paralleling the river somewhere to my right, I passed the Opera House, theatres, museums and Parliament, beautiful buildings hailing from an era before Joe Stalin turned up with a few million truckloads of ready-mix. A police blue and white Passat cruised past. The 2 guys inside had AKs on the back seat, and they both looked me up and down. My hair wasn't black, and my eyes were blue. Fuck 'em, I'd be out of here soon enough and back with Silky. The fact was, I missed her. Maybe I'd just get back to her and crisscross the continent in that van for years to come. Maybe this job would be my swan song as well. I passed the city's newest landmark. No doubt about it, the new McDonald's was the glossiest, brightest building on the main drag. It featured big time on the map. Just as well, because I couldn't read the street names in Russian and paperclip, but I could see it wouldn't be long now before I turned off the main. My plan was simple. If possible, I'd do a full 360 of the target house. My priorities were defences and escape routes. I turned left on the second junction and walked uphill into a swathe of narrow roads and cramped houses. Suddenly I was in the real Tbilisi, and I realised that I felt at home in it. Small bakers sold bread and cakes from a hole in the wall. Cars swerved round potholes and pedestrians who'd stepped into the road to avoid craters in the pavement. Abandoned vehicles and bulging bin bags littered the curbs. I carried on uphill. After navigating 3 crossroad junctions, I got to what I hoped was Barnovi Street. The target house was along here somewhere. Old, once elegant buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with the odd modern lump of glass and steel. Without exception, they were protected by high walls. I passed the French and Chinese embassies. A small hut stood outside each of them, complete with bored-looking security guard reading the morning paper. I didn't know its number, but I could tell I was at the target house from what I remembered of the bag-fit video footage. The top of the 10-foot-high wall glistened with broken glass. The sheet steel gates on my left were rusty, so was the keyhole, a simple 3-lever device. Charlie's bits and pieces would defeat it in seconds. I caught a glimpse of a blue vehicle in the gap between the gates. There was 2 inches of clearance at the bottom, and a bolt at the base of each was rammed into the ground on the inside. I turned left at the next junction. The high wall continued for about 4 metres before it turned at the junction. I followed it. The rendered wall gave way after a few metres to bare concrete blocks before turning once more onto a new road. I didn't follow it left. A blue and white was parked up. I headed right instead, towards the cemetery to check the DLB. The cemetery was up on the higher ground ahead. We might even be able to see inside the target's yard from there. Walking past a parade of shops, I texted Charlie, "Bring binos." I got back an OK, deleted it, and headed up the road. The cemetery was no more than 10 minutes away. I entered through a knackered iron gate and ran the gauntlet of the dozen old women selling flowers and long skinny candles. The cemetery itself, a labyrinth of large family burial areas, was as busy as a mall. Men and women sat chatting away to each other, cradling flasks of tea or coffee, at tables fixed to the ground close by the graves. Keeping to the central path, I tried to look like I was browsing at other people's tombstones as I made my way slowly to my family plot. I was looking for Tengiz's final resting place. Sure enough, I soon came to a large black marble headstone cordoned off by a white wrought-iron fence. I saw now why Whitewall had chosen it. Engraved portraits of 4 defiant-looking men stared out at me, with the single English word Tengiz chiselled beneath a whole load of Russian and paperclip. To one side was a black marble bench with a solid-looking base. But a line of women was sitting by the next plot, knitting, chewing sunflower seeds and gobbing off at warp speed. So I decided to see if there was a vantage point up here from where I could look down into the target yard. I spotted a place, right on the edge of the cemetery, where a lone wooden bench faced out over the ghetto. There was a sheer drop of about 20 feet down to the road below. I reached the bench and sat down. All I had to do now was try and work out which house belonged to Baz. I called Charlie, who was still shopping for binoculars. "I've found a possible. If you follow the perimeter left from the main, I'm up on the high ground." Charlie joined me on the bench about 20 minutes later. By then I'd worked out where the target was and could just about make out the blue vehicle in the yard and most of the front of the house. Charlie had a carrier bag in his hand. "I thought graveyards were supposed to be havens of tranquility," he said. "It's like a fairground here." "What do you reckon on the DLB, old one?" "Yeah, it's got to be the one. The bench support is a square of 4 sections. It's got to be hollow inside. Anyway, I'll find out tonight, won't I? By the way, I picked up a comic for you at the hotel, something to keep you occupied while I do all the work." He fished a newspaper out of the bag, followed by a pair of green miniature binos still in their packaging. It was the Georgian Times, an English-language weekly that came out on Mondays. I studied the front page as he unpeeled the binos. George Bush was to visit Tbilisi on the 10th of May, on his way back from the VE Day celebrations in Moscow. "Tbilisi in anticipation of great visit," yelled the headline. "Maybe the rush on this job has something to do with his visit," said Charlie. "You know, sort out any local difficulties before the man shows up." He shifted the binos up to his face and got busy focusing them. "Looks like there's proximity lighting and a couple of cameras covering the inside of the courtyard. Here, what do you think?" I swapped him the paper for the binos and looked down at the house. He was right. CCTV and arc lights were mounted on both front corners of the house. Under each arc light was a black plastic cylinder that we'd have to assume was a proximity detector. Charlie grinned. "So, the house. Piece of piss or what?" "Dunno yet. I need to give it some thought once we get back to the hotel. You?" "Easy. Chances are any motion detectors down there are just for the lights. Maybe they even kick off the CCTV as well. Why rig them up to the alarms? They'd go off every time a bat flew past. Poor Baz would be up all night, wouldn't he?" He took the binos from me. "You know what, lad? I think we should just go for it. Through the gates, do the old anti-detector crawl up to the main door. I'll get that open, do the business, and then we'll get our asses up here and DLB the lot. Then it's back to the hotel in time for breakfast. A nice early one, mind, because I've got a very important appointment with Air Georgia." He brought down the binos and grinned at me. "That sound like a plan?" "Sounds like a fucking nightmare." The rain had stopped as I made my way past the Opera House, taking the same route as earlier. It was my job to clear the area from the direction of the hotel. Charlie was doing the same from the other side. I'd left the hotel at about 8:30, having established a few things online. My first big question for Google was Baz's date of birth. Cracking the combination of a safe is like cracking a PIN number. People tend to use numbers they know, like their birthday, car registration or phone. It was easier than I could have hoped. The Georgian government had a website. Baz was only 45. He was born on the 22nd of October 1959. 2 junctions past McDee's, I took the left and headed uphill towards Barnoff. My mobile vibrated in my jeans pocket as a blue and white cruised downhill. I pulled it out and hit green. Charlie's voice. "All clear my side." He'd cleared the road that paralleled the target street. He'd said he wanted to be there 15 minutes before me. It wasn't my place to argue. He was the mechanic, I was the oily rag. Charlie was carrying all the MOE kit and the satchel over his shoulders. To help me blend in, I'd bought myself a black Tbilisi Dinamo basketball cap. It also covered the black ski mask that was folded on top of my head, just in case we fucked up and kicked off any of the CCTV cameras. I started to feel the trickle of sweat down my back as I made my final checks. I ran through my jeans pockets and made sure I had no loose change and that my clear rubber gloves were still there. Everything else, except the $400 rolled up in my jeans pocket, was in the room safe. My entry card was shoved behind the toilet next to the hotel's restaurant. Going on a job sterile was something that always felt uncomfortable to me. Not having my passport meant not having a means of escape. But if we got caught, we lost our passports and they knew who we were. This way, if we got caught and escaped, we still had a chance of making it out of the country. I made sure the mini maglite was in my bomber jacket's left pocket. The heavy steel CO2 canister was secure in my right. It was about 9 inches long and as effective a truncheon as I could wish for. Charlie had the other one. I'd extracted them both from a pair of fire extinguishers that I'd borrowed from the top floor of the Marriott Hotel. These CO2 canisters were our make-like burglars kit. If we did get compromised, the actions on would be the same as we employed over the water.
fight our way out and nick something, maybe even mug the person who compromised us. I did a final check of my boot soles for stones, and after a quick jump up and down to check for noise and to make sure the canister wasn't going to fall out, I was ready. Barnhof was mostly shrouded in darkness. The target house, coming up on my left, showed no lights from the top windows. No neighbours' windows lit that overlooked the gates or yard. So far, so good. I called Charlie. "Clear."
"Still clear this side. See you in 2.
The phone went dead, and this time I deleted his number before powering down. He got to the gates before me, unshouldered the satchel and placed it gently on the ground. Then he dropped to his knees. I got my back against the left-hand gate and kept checking the area as I put on my rubber gloves. Charlie was peering through the 2-inch gap at the bottom. It must have been okay in there. The Audi obviously wasn't there because he pulled his homemade tension wrenches from the satchel and got to work on the lock. It should have taken no more than 30 seconds to open. I took my eyes off the road and gave him a gentle kick. "Get on with it, you senile fucker." His shoulders rocked with silent laughter. I looked down and saw he was fighting 2 battles, one with the locks and the other with his hands. I gave him a nudge. "For fuck's sake, get on, Stag. I'll have a go." We swapped places. The tension wrench was still in place. I felt the pressure of the lever against it at the top of the lock before it turned and the gate was open. I pulled out the pick and handed it to Charlie. Then I slipped off my baseball cap, rolled the ski mask over my face and put the cap back on. As Charlie did the same, I pushed the left gate inwards very gently, just enough to squeeze myself through the gap. There was no telling how sensitively the motion detectors had been calibrated, or what their range was. I inched my way along the right-hand gate, heading for the wall. As long as you're far enough away from the sensor and against a solid background, 9 times out of 10 you can get away with it. Once I hit the wall, I stayed flat and waited for Charlie. He moved his head and shoulders back against the gate and pushed it gently too, without locking or bolting it. This was our only known escape route, and we wanted to keep it that way. A minute or 2 later, Charlie joined me. He spoke gently through the fabric. "Let's have a decent look at that door lock, eh?" We worked our way round to the corner of the house. The camera focused on the gate was mounted on the wall above us, with the motion detector immediately beneath it. We had to assume that it was angled towards the porch, so the light would go on when Baz went in or came out. We kitten-crawled the last 4 or 5 metres. Hugging the ground, we slowly pushed ourselves on our elbows and toes, just enough to move forward, an inch or 2 at a time, along the cracked wet concrete path, Charlie nudging the satchel ahead of him before he got to move himself. He finally got his head level with the 3 tiled steps leading up to the front door. Then, slowly and with infinite care, he and the satchel moved up the steps and out of my line of sight. I sucked in a lungful of air, lifted myself on my toes and elbows, and moved forward another 4 inches. My head drew level with the bottom step. Charlie was on my right, the side the door opened. He'd pulled up enough of his mask to be able to press his ear against the wood. I finally made it inside the porch and sat against the rotting brickwork. There was no need for any discussion about what came next. We'd both done this enough times, from Northern Ireland to Waco. Charlie shone his keyring torch inside the lower of the 2 locks and had a good look at what he was up against. I pulled his mask back down over his ear, then leaned over above him and pushed slowly but firmly against the top of the door to test for give. If it didn't budge, chances were it was bolted, and that would be a nightmare because we wouldn't be able to make entry covertly. It gave. No problem. Charlie turned his attention to the top lock, and I gave the bottom of the door the same treatment. It too yielded. That wasn't to say there wasn't a bolt midway, but we'd find out soon enough. Charlie got busy with the wrench. After a while I leant forward. Even in the gloom I could see his fingers were going 19 to the dozen. I shone the torch on his right hand. It was trembling like an alcoholic with the DTs. He sat wearily back against the wall and put 5 fingers in the torch beam, opening and closing them twice. I nodded. I'd give him 10 minutes, maybe 15. He wanted to do this, not just because he was being paid, but because we both knew it was his very last time out of the paddock. I waited for the full 15, and by the end of it Charlie had defeated the bottom lock. Still on all fours, he packed the wrenches away before easing the door open a few inches so it didn't creak or bang tight against a security chain. He waited a moment to see if any alarms kicked off, then poked his head through the gap to have a quick look and a listen. It was time for me to get my boots off, ready to do my bit. I shoved them down the front of my bomber jacket and zipped them in, then liberated my mag light and the CO2 canister. Charlie crawled back to where I'd been sitting. He'd get his own boots off, prepare the camcorder, and wipe the porch dry with one of the towels I'd nicked from the hotel. When Baz got home, there mustn't be the slightest trace that we'd paid him a visit. I flicked the maglite to my right. There were 2 receptors each side of the door and flat bars lying on the floor with a pair of padlocks. I checked Baby G. It was 2:28. We had to find the safe and defeat it, and we only had about 4 hours left until first light. I took 2 paces and stopped to give Charlie room to come in. He was already taking IR film with the camcorder, but switched it to standby. The plan was to record the layout of the place wherever we went, then check it on the way out to make sure we'd left everything exactly as we'd found it. The doors off the corridor were all open, and we went through them one by one. The first phase of a house search is always a quick once-over. It's on phase 2 that you start moving sofas, lifting carpets, looking up the chimney. The door at the far end opened into the kitchen. When I opened the door fully, I found myself facing the external wall. Set into it, directly ahead of me, was what would have been the back door if it hadn't been covered completely by a large steel plate bolted firmly into place. I turned back up the hallway, tapped Charlie on the shoulder, and aimed the torch at the door to our right, about 3 paces ahead. The small red LED on the camcorder began blinking again. I gave it a gentle push. It looked like I was in somebody's sewing room. A treadle sat in the far corner, next to a wooden bench top, but there were no half-made clothes or swatches of material. No place for a safe. I made my way back into the hallway and signalled to the door opposite. Charlie was right behind me, recording. This was much more promising. It was obviously Baz's office. I moved out of the way to let Charlie past. He panned the camera left to right before we started moving stuff around. I headed first for the desk, in case there was a number on the phone. There wasn't. We had better luck with the cupboard. Having checked for telltales, I pulled open the door, and bingo, we'd found what we'd come for. I stepped back to let Charlie see the prize. He filmed the safe inch by inch, every bit of chipped grey paint, every word of Russian Cyrillic. It was about 2 foot square and solid, a combination cylinder dead centre. Then Charlie handed me the camcorder, tested the handle, and fished inside his bag. He brought out a towel and knelt on it in front of the safe. Carefully, he unrolled the fibre-optic viewing device from a strip of hotel towel. I fired up the camcorder and went over to Baz's desk, filming everything on the top first, then the positions of individual drawers. I lifted the telephone, but there was nothing taped underneath. I checked for telltales on each drawer and went through them one by one. I found sheet after sheet of paper in paperclip and Russian, but no key to the safe or anything scribbled down that resembled a combination. I looked over at Charlie. Torch clenched between his ski mask-clad teeth, fibre optic inside the keyway. He was manipulating the controls like a surgeon. Finally, he removed the fibre optic, rolled it into its piece of towel, and replaced it in the satchel. He leaned towards me. "Piece of piss, lad. The daylock is warded. The combination, well, it's a combination, anything up to 4 hours. Don't worry, there were loads like this in Bosnia." The ward lock, at least, was going to be easy. It was basically a spring-loaded bolt into which a notch had been cut. Charlie unwrapped a set of what looked like button hooks fashioned from strong, thin steel. All being well, one of them would bypass the wards and shift the bolt into the unlock position. In next to no time I heard the deadlock clunk open, and Charlie's head swayed from side to side in triumph as he packed the hooks away. The combination cylinder was next. Charlie started rotating the cylinder left and right. He may have been trying Baz's number plate first, or running through the Russian factory default settings. Once he'd exhausted the obvious ones, he'd have to go through every possible permutation. He leant over to me. "DOB?" 22-10-59. His hands started to turn the cylinder. Nothing. No sound. No falling lever. Charlie played with the 3 number sets in sequence, but varying the direction of rotation. After a dozen or so other attempts, he tried 2-2 anti-clockwise, 5-9 clockwise, 2-2 anti-clockwise. There was a gentle clunk from inside the door. Charlie picked up his torch and shone it round the floor to make triply sure that he'd left nothing lying around. Then he pulled down the handle. The door swung open. Charlie still had the keyring torch in his mouth, and his head was inside the safe. I leaned over him. It held just 2 items, an open box of antique jewellery and a blue plastic folder. Charlie lifted it straight out and handed it over. A quick sweep of the maglite revealed about 20 pages of handwritten paperclip. The next second, the door burst open and the lights came on. There were 2 of them, hollering at us in Russian or paperclip. They were both carrying suppressed pistols with big bulky barrels. We raised our hands. I kept my left elbow slightly bent to try and keep the CO2 canister in place. Their faces weren't masked, and that was bad news. They didn't care about being identified. One was dark with stubble, the other had bloodshot eyes. It looked like the one with the bloodshot eyes was in charge. He glared at me and opened his leather jacket repeatedly with his spare hand. I got the message. Keeping my right hand up, I unzipped my bomber very slowly with my left. My boots dropped onto the carpet. Charlie followed suit. They now knew that neither of us was carrying, but that didn't stop the shouting. I didn't know what else they wanted, and I wasn't going to ask. Red Eyes moved towards Charlie, pistol ready, while Stubbly covered him. He waved his free hand, shouted, gesticulated at the floor. Charlie got it. The boy was after the folder. He reached down and picked it up with his left hand. Red Eyes grabbed it and jammed his weapon into Charlie's neck. Keeping the muzzle right where it was, Red Eyes bent down and reached into the safe. The jewellery found its way into his jacket pocket with the speed and precision of a conjuring trick. For a finale, he yanked off Charlie's mask, then gave me the same treatment. Next, he pulled out a cell phone and punched in a number. Whoever was at the other end answered immediately. Red Eyes studied each of us in turn, giving what sounded like a description, then picked up the document and quoted a couple of chunks from it. I didn't understand what he was saying, but I got the drift. Whatever problems they'd expected to have to deal with in the house, they now had 2 extra ones. Red Eyes was still waffling into the phone and riffling through the papers when we heard a metallic rattle from the direction of the street. He stopped in mid-sentence. There was a loud creak as the front gate swung open. Red Eyes closed down the conversation and ran out into the hall. He was back in less than 10 seconds. He rolled up the folder, thrust it into his jacket, yelled a couple of instructions at Stubbly, and disappeared again. Stubbly raised his weapon. There was no time to think. I lunged at him, aiming my shoulder at his gut. He tottered backwards under the impact, hit the wall, and before he could recover, I dragged him down with me, my hands flailing. The next second I heard a sound like a watermelon hitting a pavement. Charlie had given Stubbly's skull the good news with his CO2 kosh. I ran out of the room, shoving my right hand into the left sleeve of my bomber jacket as I went. Red Eyes was ahead of me. The hall was flooded with light, and he swung back the door. I could see that the gates into the street were open. Baz's Audi swept into the courtyard. I sprinted along the carpet as Red Eyes half ran, half tumbled down the porch steps. There was a shower of glass as he emptied his magazine into the driver's window, and he pirouetted like a matador as the vehicle coasted past him into the wall. I took the steps in one, canister in hand. Leaping up before he had a chance to collect himself, I swung the heavy metal tube down onto the top of his head. He dropped like a cow under a stun gun, and his weapon skidded across the wet concrete. I grabbed it, turned, and fired into his skull. I dropped the weapon and ran back into the house. Charlie was as cool as a cucumber. He'd slipped his mask back on and was hoisting the satchel over his shoulder. "Give me 5, he said. "I'll try and find the CCTV monitors. There might be tapes." I grabbed my own mask off the floor and pulled it over my head as I legged it back to the front door. I slammed the gate shut. Then, struggling to put on the mask, I ran over to the car. The driver's body was slumped face upwards over the central console. It was Baz, all right. He'd taken rounds in the head, neck and shoulder. I pulled the door open, grabbed hold of his arm and dragged him clear. I returned to the house and called up to Charlie, who was on the landing. "Dead body! Bring some bed covers down, anything! Got to cover the car seats!" I ran into the office and grabbed my boots. No time to do them up properly. I shoved the laces under the tongue so I didn't trip up. Speed was everything. We had to get out of here. Back in the yard, I rolled Red Eyes over and pulled the folder from his jacket. Charlie jumped down the steps with 2 multicoloured bedspreads dragging behind him. "Any luck with the CCTV?" He shook his head. "Could be anywhere. Let's just fuck off." We threw the bedspreads over the front seats. Charlie dumped the satchel in the back and I slid into the driver's side. Charlie secured the gates as well as he could and jumped in beside me. "Those 2 must already have been in the house," said Charlie as we sped off, "waiting for Baz to come home, make him open the safe, then drop him." "But didn't Whitewall tell you Baz was away all night?" I said, weaving between the potholes. "Where does that leave us with everything else?" I took a left up towards the cemetery. "But hey," said Charlie, "we're still here, aren't we? A quick trip to the DLB, then it's bye-bye Georgia." In open ground opposite the cemetery, I switched off the engine and killed the lights. Charlie wrapped the batch of paper in a plastic bag. "The old hands are wobbling a bit. Maybe you should do the drop-off." He handed over the pistol. 2 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. I double-checked the safety catch before shoving it down the front of my jeans and the plastic bag into my bomber pocket. I pulled out my phone and switched on. "I'll call when I'm done. If you see any dramas coming in, just give a call, okay?" Charlie nodded as he slid into the driver's seat. "I'll need your torch as well." He handed it over. "See you in a bit." I headed for the open gate. A few minutes later, I was at the Tengiz headstone. Shining the torch, I moved across the plot to the bench. I bent down and pulled. There was a low grinding noise as it moved, and a quick flash of the torch confirmed I had the gap I needed. In went the bag of papers, the torch went back in my pocket, and I started to pull back the slab. There was a crunch of feet on gravel behind me. I spun round. A figure was closing in on me, arms raised. This boy was huge. As the arm came down, I stepped to my left, trying to check it in mid-stride. I was lucky. Steel clattered against stone as something very unfriendly fell from his hands. I tried to grab the pistol grip, but he was ahead of me. He yelled and lunged, and we crashed onto the pathway. Maybe 19 stone of him pressed down on me, keeping my arms pinioned above my head. "Charlie!" I yelled, bucking and kicking. "Charlie!" He let go of my arms and decided to throttle me instead. Massive fingers closed around my throat, and he brought his face closer and closer. When his nose was only inches away from mine, I got my chance. I lunged, and my teeth caught him just on the bridge. I bit down on the hard bone above the cartilage and kept on going. He flung his head from side to side in an attempt to shake me off, but I was like a terrier hanging onto a stick. He went berserk with pain, thrashing about like a game fish under a harpoon. Suddenly the bone collapsed like a peanut shell. His sinuses exploded. Blood and snot spurted from the hole in his face, and he let out a scream of rage and pain. I managed to turn us onto our sides and force my hand down between us until it could close around the cold metal of the pistol grip. I brought the muzzle up beneath his armpit, released safety, and squeezed. He took the round full in the chest. I crawled away and sat against Tengiz's stone,
gobbing out blood. Finally, gulping oxygen, I fished out the mobile. "Back the car up to the gate. Get the boot open. We've got a drama." He didn't answer, he just closed down. He knew what was going into the back. I crawled over to the bench, still trying to gulp in air, and managed to heave the slab far enough to get my hand through the gap. I fished about until my fingers brushed against the plastic bag. The papers went back in my jacket pocket. Until the Hulk had turned up, I'd given Whitewall and whoever pulled his strings the benefit of the doubt, but I wouldn't any longer. Charlie and I were being well and truly fucked over. No one was getting this now. It was ours. Sunday, the 1st of May. 10:09 a.m, and the terminal was heaving with passengers waiting for international flights, all of which had been delayed. I sat by the market stalls across the road with a lot of other people to avoid the crush. Our flight to Vienna was due to take off at 10:30, but we weren't even being allowed to check in. There was only one departure gate and only enough room airside for one plane load of passengers. We'd covered our tracks as effectively as we could, but that didn't stop me feeling uncomfortable. Red Eyes and his mate hadn't done us any favours when they'd ripped our masks off, and it wouldn't take Inspector Morse to link us to Baz's Audi and the bodies in his driveway. I just wanted to get the fuck out of here. Freedom felt so close I could spit at it, but we were still the wrong side of the glass partition. A lot of us had moved out here to escape the crush, and the taxi drivers were really pissed off about it. They didn't want to share their world with a load of foreigners. The shed owners weren't too happy about it either. Each of them sat behind their identical chocolate and gum-laden counters, making it very clear that the portable black-and-white TV on the shelf behind them was a great deal more appealing than the potential customers in front. A bored-looking anchorwoman with big black hair was presenting a news programme on all 3 screens. It was obviously another slow day at the network. We were treated to endless vistas of grand buildings or lingering shots of Georgian soldiers in US BDUs, with Richard the Lionheart insignia stuck all over them, sitting purposefully in the back of trucks or running courageously up and down hills. We'd made it to the hotel at just before 4. The kit had stayed with the body in the boot. We had to walk back into the city clean, just in case a curious blue and white wanted to know what we were lugging about this time of the morning. The weapon went down an open manhole that no man or beast in their right mind would consider even looking down. Then we'd played a couple of drunken arseholes back from a night on the piss, jackets inside out and tied round our waists to cover the worst of the blood and mud. As it turned out, nobody raised an eyebrow. It was just another Saturday night in downtown Tbilisi. I'd retrieved my card from behind the cistern and burnt the close target recce tape. Even our mobiles got the good news from my boot heel after a wipe down to dispose of prints. We'd come into this country sterile, and we had to leave the same way. The Marriott tape, though, stayed with us. It was just too valuable to lose control of. We needed as much bargaining power as possible. It was in my dark blue Rowan trousers, and I'd slipped the first 10 pages of the document in Baz's safe inside a magazine in the pocket of my khaki jacket. Charlie, waiting in the terminal, had the other half. I felt a call to Crazy Dave coming on. I'd persuade him to put us in touch with whoever the fuck had dreamed up this job and give them the chance to buy the papers in return for coughing up the second half of Charlie's 200 grand. Next time I looked at my watch, it was 11:05. 2 men came out of the terminal, dragging their carry-ons behind them. They were clearly in a good mood and anxious to share it. "Hey, good news, fellas!" one shouted at us. "The Vienna flight's at 12:25. We got to check in now." With sighs of relief and jokes about Georgian inefficiency, people gathered their bags and headed for the terminal. I stood up just as Charlie emerged from the main entrance, laptop bag on his shoulder. He saw me, up and ready, and turned back. I was about to follow when I glimpsed the latest news bulletin on one of the portable TV sets that adorned every stall. And what I saw made me sit down again.
Baz's Audi filled the screen. Then the camera homed in on the open boot where the Hulk lay curled up like a baby. It zoomed in even closer on the entry wounds. I tried to calm myself. I mean, so what? We'd be checking in any minute. In just over an hour, we'd be airborne. Then my heart switched to rapid fire as they broadcast the pictures that killed any hope I had of boarding the 12:25 to Vienna. It was a few seconds of fuzzy black and white CCTV footage at the point where I'd turned back to the house after dropping red eyes. They reran it, then freeze-framed on my face. The next CCTV clip showed us both masked up as I got into the Audi and Charlie opened the gate. So it was official. I was in the shit. They had a face and were looking for it. Head down, I made my way across the road to the terminal and the endless checking queue. I found Charlie and got eye to eye. I headed for the toilets. He followed. All the cubicle doors were open. We were alone. "It's hit the news. You're okay, but they got my face." Charlie wasn't fazed. "I'll hire a car. We'll get to the border by tonight and walk across. Piece of piss. Let's go." He started to move, but I grabbed his arm. "Too risky. They'll be checking car hire. Take the papers, get the flight, get to Crazy Dave, and stand by. As soon as I get into Turkey, I'll give you a call. I think we can still get you the rest of the money." Charlie wasn't listening. He shoved his laptop bag at me. "Bang the tape and papers in here. If you get lifted, at least I might have something here that'll get you out of the shit. Follow me, lad." He strode towards the terminal exit as I shoved everything in the bag, like a fumbling PA following in the wake of his boss. As we walked out of the terminal, Charlie said, "Wait here," and carried on straight towards a young guy in a blue sweatshirt sitting at the wheel of a hardtop 110 Land Rover. Charlie had his purposeful warrant officer face on. The driver, a young white guy with a crew cut, watched him all the way to his window. A green, heavy plastic sleeve lay on the dash. It was the 110's work ticket folder, a log of the hours and mileage done, and had duty vehicles stencilled across it. Charlie tapped on the glass and motioned him to wind it down. "Duty driver, you dropping off or picking up?" "Dropping off." Charlie exploded. "Dropping off, sir!" He turned to me. "Bring my bag here." I jerked my head. "Yes, sir." I joined him and handed over the bag. "What camp are you from?" demanded Charlie. "Camp Bassiani, sir." "That the only camp in this area?" "Yes, sir." "That's where we're going, then." Charlie bounced back to me. "Why weren't any joining instructions sent to me?" "I don't know, sir. I sent an email requesting—" "Not good enough. Why isn't there anyone here to pick us up?" I don't know, sir." Charlie opened the rear door, slotted in the laptop, and pointed at me. "In." I saw it now. Charlie wanted me in the front because we were going to do a bit of hijacking. He glowered at the driver. "How far to camp?" "Just under an hour, sir, but I have to get permission to—" Charlie's hand told him to shut up. "Just drive. We'll sort it out on the way. Can't your fucking officers even organize a pickup?" He jumped into the back as the duty driver leaned across and flicked a switch on his radio. Charlie was quick off the mark. "Give me that headset, and get going." Charlie turned his attention to the radio. "Who is this?" "Well, Sergeant J. DeRita, I did not receive any joining instructions, not even the name of the person I have come all the way from Istanbul to see." He listened to DeRita. "You have no visitors scheduled for today? Well, Sergeant DeRita, you do now. We'll be there soon to try to make sense of this total cock-up." He passed the headset forward to the driver and sat fuming. I scanned the dashboard. "Got a map?" The map he handed me wasn't much, but at least I could see the Vassiani region, about 30 k's northeast of the city. It looked like our current route would take us around the bottom of Tbilisi, then up towards the camp. We soon reached the mountains and wove our way towards a sky filled with doom-laden clouds. As we made our way down the other side, we emerged into a huge valley,
with a network of rivers and streams and at least 10 k's of undulating ground separating the mountains on either side. It wasn't going to be easy lifting this thing. There was a constant stream of military trucks, full of bored Georgian squaddies rolling their heads from side to side, and packed-out buses with sacks of spuds and all sorts strapped on top, bouncing between towns. Then, passing yet another of them heading towards the city, we drove into a depression a couple of 100 metres long. Dead ground. It was as good a place as any. I held up a hand. "I need a piss." The driver pulled up on the grass verge. I got out and walked round the front of the wagon so I could position myself on the driver's side before moving towards the rear. Charlie also got out. He wandered past the radiator grill and seemed to spot something. He pointed underneath the bonnet. "What's this? Driver, get out!" The squaddie jumped dutifully out and joined Charlie at the front of the vehicle. I turned and followed, 2 steps behind. I closed my hands around his mouth and jaw and jumped on his back. I pulled his head into my chest, wrapped my legs around his waist, and toppled backwards. I landed in the grass, with him on top of me, and hooked my legs through the inside of his. I pulled back hard and kept my body and legs rigid. Charlie leaned over him and raised his finger. "Cool it, son. We're not here to hurt you." Charlie went through his pockets and threw the contents onto the grass. "Now listen, son. We're going to take the wagon and we're going to leave you here. I know it won't be your idea of a perfect day out, but just accept it. If you start playing silly buggers, we're going to have to slap you about a bit and take you with us. If you behave, we'll let you go. Now that's not rocket science, is it?" The squaddie nodded as best he could with his head still compressed against my shoulder. "I'm going to let go of you now," I said. "I want you to just roll off and start walking away. That's all you have to do, mate, okay?" He gave something approaching a nod. "Okay, here we go." I released my grip, untangled my legs, and he did exactly as he'd been told. As Charlie jumped into the back seat, I switched on the radio. If anyone was going to start gobbing off about us, I wanted to hear it. We were good for fuel. The tank was 3/4 full. No surprises there. Duty wagons were always topped up after every job. I grabbed the map and traced the route round the north of the city in case we could head west and chuck a left towards Turkey. We'd driven for less than an hour when we came to the top of a rise, and in the distance was the camp, maybe a k off the road along what looked like a newly laid gravel track. It was the size of a small city. Dozens of green 20-man tents stood in smart regimented lines along the side of a chain-link fence compound. To their right lay a maze of porter-cabin-type structures with satellite dishes on their roofs. 5 or 6 Hueys were parked in a neat line beside a helicopter pan. The main drag continued for maybe 3 k's past the junction towards another camp on higher ground. "Any bright ideas?" I said. Charlie shook his head. "We've got to keep on. Nowhere else to go. And we're in a company wagon, aren't we? Let's hope the driver hasn't managed to raise the alarm yet." I put my foot down and we accelerated past the turnoff to first camp. The track was actually hardcore and stretched a k or so to the main gate, where massive US and Georgian flags fluttered shoulder to shoulder in the breeze. The fields either side of us were a hive of activity. The Partnership for Peace program was in full swing. American unarmed combat instructors were putting Georgian troops through their paces. They looked as though they were having a great time. No one gave us a second glance. I kept my foot to the floor as we moved uphill towards the second camp. "Hello, duty vehicle. Is that you on the hill? Report. Over." I looked at Charlie. He shrugged. Somebody with nothing better to do was watching us through their binos. I changed down to second to get a spurt on past the camp. "Duty vehicle, do not go any further. Repeat, do not go any further. Return to our locale. Over." We ignored it again. The throttle was flat to the boards. The engine screamed as we headed on up the hill. "Do not cross the demarcation line. Repeat, return to this locale. Over." Demarcation line? Charlie peered up the hill. These two places in the middle of a union dispute? Something like that. I nodded in the direction of the flags flying over the gates of the camp, now about 150 ahead on our left, the white, blue and red horizontals of the Russian Federation. "Fuck it," said Charlie. "Keep going. Let's take our chances." As we drew level with the main gate, I slowed, and the speedo flickered near 20. Nobody on the road seemed to know what to do. They were all mouthing the Russian for "what the fuck's a British 110 doing up here?" Thankfully, they all still had their AKs across their shoulders, rather than pointing at us. Charlie started to wave. "How's it going, lads?" They stared back, then some of the younger ones smiled and returned the wave. We trundled past, Prince Charlie in the back still doing his greet the people bit. Still nobody challenged us. The radio barked. "Duty vehicle, turn around. Do not stop. Do not take any action that is deemed aggressive. If apprehended, comply with their orders." I flicked the radio off. Moments later, we were going gently downhill, no longer in view from the American camp. Charlie turned and looked back. "Get that foot down, lad." Absolutely no argument with him on that one. For maybe 30 minutes we raced on, up to 90 k's an hour in some places where the road surface allowed it. I was feeling pretty pleased with myself. Then I heard something very familiar, and my heart sank. Charlie wound down his window. The noise was unmistakable, the steady throb of heavy rotor blades. They had a pipeline to protect. Of course they'd have a quick reaction force on standby. I just wished they hadn't taken the quick bit so much to heart. The steady beat seemed to come up level with us, and then the Huey broke out of the dead ground to our right. For the 2 seconds it was overhead, I could see that both the side doors were pulled back and the space between them was heaving with guys in dark green battle dress. They waved urgently, pointed weapons, gestured at us to stop. I kept my foot down. The Huey flared away and disappeared into dead ground ahead. Moments later, another set of rotors started beating the air behind us. Huey 2 passed directly over us, following the road. The 110 shook violently. The heli scooted about 200 metres ahead and turned back round to face us. Its skids bounced onto the road and troops started jumping into the haze of its exhaust fumes. From our right, I heard Huey 1 take up station behind us. It was going to drop its troops to cut us off. I yanked the wagon hard left, over the rough ground towards the tree line. Huey 1 immediately turned back towards us and swooped like a kestrel onto a field mouse, settling at a hover just feet above us. We had maybe 300 to go. My head bounced off the roof as the wagon took on the terrain. The heli moved ahead and landed. More troops fanned out and took up fire positions between us and the tree line. I swung the wheel right. Safety was just 200 away now. Charlie called out, "They've got caltrops!" I kept my foot hard to the floor, leaning over the wheel, urging the 110 closer to the cover of the trees. Just over 100 to go. Charlie pulled the tape and papers from the computer bag, ready to run. The caltrops were only metres ahead, coming in left to right. Then they fell, and the tyres hit almost immediately. The steering wheel vibrated violently in my hands for several seconds, then the wagon simply came to a halt. Tyres deflated, the wheel rims had just ploughed into the mud. Now both helis were on us. Guys in battle dress jumped out just metres away, weapons up. I raised my hands very slowly and placed them on the dash where they could be seen. A black guy in spotty camouflage, 2 bars on his lapel, shouted from the front of the wagon. "Get out of the vehicle!" We didn't fuck around. Minutes later, handcuffed, we were hauled aboard the second Huey, which took off immediately. We hugged the side of the valley, using it as cover from the Russians, who'd be up there somewhere radioing a progress report to Moscow. We flew low and fast, trees, animals and buildings zooming past in a blur, then surged over the ridge and Camp Vassiani spread out ahead of us. We hovered over the concrete pan and came into land. No sooner were the skids on the ground than we were manhandled in the direction of a waiting 110. In the distance, the other Huey appeared over the ridgeline, the Land Rover dangling from its belly. We were bounced around the camp perimeter and eventually arrived at the porter-cabin complex. The lieutenant dismounted and shouted a series of orders. 3 US Marines stood to on our right in body armour and Kevlar helmets, weapons in the shoulder. Their message was clear. "Hands in the air!" We did exactly as we were told. "You!" shouted the Marine closest to me. "You with the dark hair! Get out of the vehicle and get out real slow! The old one, stay where you are!" I stifled a grin. Charlie wasn't going to like that one bit. I got out slowly, making sure they saw my hands at all times. The guy covering me came round to my side of the vehicle and stopped a couple of metres away, his barrel pointing into the centre of my chest. It was now Charlie's turn to be hollered at. I heard, rather than saw him, step down from the wagon. My escort gripped the spacer bar on my cuffs and yanked my hands in front of me, and a couple of his mates gave me a brisk search. They didn't seem at all pleased about us nicking their wagon. A set of hands grabbed each of my arms and half carried, half dragged me along the hard-standing and up 2 wooden steps. We turned down a wide, windowless corridor and stopped outside a bare room furnished only with a single aluminium chair and a table. Charlie was no longer behind me. I didn't like that at all. One of the guys pushed me inside and sat me down. Then, without saying a word, another of them grabbed the spacer bar and yanked my cuffed hands behind my head. The weight of my arms pulled it into the back of my neck, so I tried to hunch up to take some of the pressure off my wrists. I was pulled back up by the hair. "Sit straight, you fuck!" 4 guys and a woman were in the room with me, all in uniform, with radio earpieces and pistols in black nylon leg holsters. The woman stood in front of me. "Undress." The cuffs were released and blood rushed back into my hands as I started to pull off my kit. She dug into her box of tricks and snapped her hands into a pair of surgical gloves. I noticed a badge with 2 coiled snakes on her lapel. Medical Corps. I stood with my clothes in a heap at my feet. She pointed to the chair. "Sit down." The 4 guys formed a semicircle in front of me. One of them had a can of mace at the ready, another held a taser. The woman pushed my head back and dug inside my mouth with a spatula. Then she probed around my gums with a finger. What next? She dipped back into the box for a party-sized tube of KY jelly. She squeezed some onto the first and middle fingers of her right hand. "Stand up, bend over and touch your toes." I had only one consolation. It was going to be worse for her than me. I'd been saving up all day for a dump. I felt her fingers slide in, have a good dig around, then withdraw. "Stand up." The heel of a boot slammed into my back and sent me flying towards the wall. I knew that was just for starters. I took the fall, curled up tight, and waited. Boots advanced on me across the floor. One of the radios crackled, and the wearer quickly pushed in his earpiece to keep it private. He conveyed whatever had been said to him to the others in hushed tones. They looked at me, clearly disappointed. That was it then. They must know I was the TV star. It was now Georgian police time. The medic pointed at the chair. "Sit." They grabbed my wrists and forced them up against my temples, then got busy with gaffer tape. They wrapped it around my hands and head like a bandage, then down under my chin for good measure. Next, they turned their attention to my arms, binding them together just above the elbows, locking them firmly under my chin. No order was given, but they suddenly stepped back as one and left the room. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees. I must have stayed like that for an hour, maybe more. Then I did my best to uncurl myself and stretch my back and legs, trying to relieve the pain in my muscles and the pressure points against the lino. Every bone in my body ached. What wrong turning had led me here? My arse leaking KY jelly, my head mummified with gaffer tape. Deep down, I'd always known that I'd fuck up big time one day, but it had never bothered me much. Until Kelly came along. Funny how a snot-nosed kid can make you pay attention. I was never the knight in shining armour she deserved, and nothing I did would stop me blaming myself for failing to save her life. I knew I was always destined to be smack at the bottom of the food chain, and I'd almost got to like it. But Kelly made me dare to think for a moment that there might be something better around the corner. And now Silky was doing it all over again. She'd become my gatekeeper, my interpreter, in a world that spoke a language I barely understood. I couldn't believe how much I missed her. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the sum total of my feelings wasn't bollocks to that. I was actually looking forward to being with someone. I curled myself up again, closed my eyes, and tried to think good things. I lay there for what seemed like hours. Then I heard shoes, not boots, approaching down the corridor. The door was flung open, and the room was plunged into darkness. There were two of them gripping me, one either side. Then all I could smell was turnips as a scratchy nylon sack was pulled over my head. My two new best mates exchanged a word or two in paperclip, then they dragged me out into the corridor. We turned left through a set of swing doors, then on again through another. A gust of cold air played across my bare skin, shrinking everything except the goosebumps. Chips of gravel punctured the soles of my feet as I hobbled towards the open tailgate of a waiting estate car. I was bundled inside onto a bed of blankets. Another blanket was thrown over me, and the tailgate slammed shut. The engine fired up, and we crunched past the porter cabins. Next, we rumbled over the kilometre or so of hardcore towards the main and took the left. Then we moved slowly along the metalled road, with only the occasional shake and rattle as we encountered a good old-fashioned pothole. After half an hour, I knew that this definitely wasn't normal police stuff. If we'd been going back to the city, we would have done so by now. Soon the car slowed as we turned onto much rougher ground. I curled up tight. The engine cut out. Both front doors opened, and there was the crunch of shoes on stones. The tailgate was lifted, and the blanket pulled away. The cold air hit me like a slap in the bollocks. I was dragged across a stretch of wet grass. A door swung open, and I was pulled through it into what felt like a sauna. I stumbled forwards a few paces, then felt pressure on my shoulders. My arse connected with a plastic chair, then they pulled off the sack. I kept my head down, but my eyes went into overdrive. I was in a small room with rough stone walls and a compacted earth floor. In front of me was a blue plastic picnic table with metal legs. 2 hurricane lamps sat at either end of it. My passport and Charlie's lay in between them. The driver and his mate were behind me, breathing heavily after the exertion of frog-marching me from the car. A pair of US desert boots appeared on the other side of the table. The chinos above them looked as though they'd been inflated by a high-pressure hose. A thin-barreled .22 semi-automatic was pointing straight at my forehead, held rock-steady in a latex-gloved hand. When I saw who it belonged to, the Georgian secret police suddenly seemed like the soft option. Towering over me was at least 250 pounds of fat, topped off by an all-too-familiar white-wall haircut. Jim, call me Buster Bastendorf, the man we'd rechristened Bastard at Waco, had hardly changed a bit in the 12 years since I'd last seen him. End of Disc 2. Disc 3. All of a sudden my hands felt strangely comfortable around my head. All the same, I clenched my teeth and closed my eyes. I'd fucked up and had to accept whatever followed. I opened my eyes. Bastard was still above me. "Now, son, who the fuck are you?" "You got my passport. Give it a read." He looked down at me. I knew from his expression that he hadn't made the connection between a compound full of dead Davidians, Anthony the Brit fag scientist, and me, and I wasn't going to help him out. "Listen," I said, "we have you on video, handing over equipment at the Marriott in Istanbul." The first punch was to my right temple and caught me square on. I managed to stay on the chair, but it was a while before splinters of light stopped dancing in front of my eyes. "Shut the fuck up! You're in deep shit, boy. The police want your ass big time. You're responsible for the murder of their answer to that Bob fucking Geldof guy, and they don't see the funny side of that. And you know what? I'll give those fucks just exactly what they want if you don't offer me a little cooperation." He hit me twice more. The second blow took me down onto the hard earth floor. "That's what I want. Cooperation." The two boys leant down either side of me and heaved me back up onto the chair. Then they dug a pair of scissors into the gaffer tape and started to cut and pull. As the tape was yanked away, it took clumps of my hair and eyebrows with it. There was a positive side to it, though. I felt the blood rushing back into my arms. "Sit up, Nick. Enjoy the party." I tipped my head a little and looked behind me. The two boys were the shiny-headed bouncers I'd seen in the Pajero outside the Marriott. Bastard drew up another plastic chair on his side of the table, all sweetness and light. An aluminium thermos now sat between the lamps. "Go on, son, have a coffee. It's good and strong." I leant forward, took the flask, and unscrewed the lid. At times like this, you've got to take whatever's on offer. I poured hot black coffee into 2 plastic cups and pushed one across the table. He took a sip. He knew what I was doing. If I got drugged, so did he. "Any chance of my clothes?" "Sure." He leant back, lifted another grey sack from the floor, and tipped my kit out in front of me. I dressed quickly, checking my pockets as I went. No cash, definitely no passport. Nothing apart from Baby G. "Where's Charlie?" Bastard sampled a little more of his coffee. "You guys look out for each other, don't you? I like that." "So help me out here," I said. "Having Charlie dropped once he'd done the safe, that's getting things done your way, is it? Looks like it was just as well I came along." "I had nothing to do with that," said the bastard. "Whichever fucks on the top floor," he pointed skywards, "made that decision. They didn't ask me along. All I know is that Chuck was going to do the job, and I supplied the support, the kit, the information. But you know what, Nick? You did a hell of a job saving your asses out there, considering the problems you had." This wasn't the bastard, I knew. But then, this wasn't bastard. This was just a good old boy fronting a set of interrogation techniques. He was deploying what the manual called pride and ego up. The theory was I'd be feeling devastated by the capture and would respond to praise for a job well done. What he didn't know was that my pride and ego had been well and truly hung out to dry more years ago than I cared to remember. I nodded to show how glad I was that he understood me. "We did all right. Who was that at the house and cemetery?" Bastard shook his head, as if Red Eyes, Stubbly, and the Man Mountain with the machete had all dropped out of a clear blue sky. "No idea. But those fucks sure messed up a good operation." He leant forward. "Nick, I'm sure you want to get this sorry business over with and get home to your loved ones. But I got a problem, and you can help me with it." He looked at me and smiled. "Chuck tells me he has 2 tapes of the hotel meets. He also says you've got the very thing we're in this fucked up country for." I did my best to look completely blank. "Those papers." What was he saying? That he didn't have them? "You see, the people I worked for really need to get their heads around those papers. And the tapes? Well, I could find myself in a very embarrassing situation if they go public. It'd kind of fuck up my retirement plan." He ramped up the smile to full megawatt capacity. If he wasn't careful, his face was going to explode. "I need you guys to help me out, right? You're just too smart for me. What can I say?" He leant across the table. That smile must have been killing him. "Why don't we clear this business up tonight, and we can all be on a flight out of this goddamn shithole of a country first thing? What about it, Nick? What do you say?" "I have to talk to Charlie." He stormed round the table and swung an open-handed slap across the side of my head, which took me straight to the ground. He bent over me. "Give up the tapes. Give up the papers. I got contacts, high-up government contacts, that can make good things happen for you. Think about it, asshole. Think about it while I go back to Vassiarni and smooth out the mess you made with the army." He passed behind me on his way to the door. "Tapes and papers by the time I get back, or Harry and Kunzru here will rip them out of you before you spend the rest of your fucking miserable life in a Georgian shithole jail." The door opened and closed, and he was gone. He must have signalled to Harry and Kunzru on his way out. They grabbed an arm each and lifted me to my feet. I got shoved out into an overgrown walled area. We moved along a muddy path to another building. A door was unbolted, and I was pushed into pitch darkness. The door slammed shut behind me, and the bolt scraped back into place. I sat down on the hard earth. There wasn't as much as a pinprick of light. Then a voice. "You took your time, dickhead." Charlie. I was so relieved I burst out laughing. I felt my way over on all fours and parked my arse next to him. "Where the fuck are the papers, Charlie? And the tape?" "The duty wagon, under the back seat. All we got to do now is get out of here, go find the wagon, and use that shit to get us home. You up for it, lad?" "Big time. By the way, his name's Bastendorf. Remember him from Waco? He commanded Alpha Pod. We called him Bastard." "I like the name," said Charlie, "but I had fuck all to do with the pods. He recognise you?" "No, and I want to be well out of here before he does. He's going back to the camp. If they've searched the wagon and found the gear, we're good as dead." "So, we checking out of here or what?" We started groping along the walls for another door or a hastily blocked-up window. We worked our way back round to the main door without success. I ran my hand along the wall on either side of the frame, and it closed around a loose, protruding stone. I suddenly had a thought. Remember the stoner in Colombia? That could be our way out. "Well, fucking hell. You're not just a nice pair of buttocks, are you, lad?" We'd neither of us forgotten a particular incident back in the late 80s when Charlie and I had been part of Thatcher and Reagan's first strike policy in Colombia against the drug traffic. We got down on our hands and knees and felt around on the ground for loose rocks. It wasn't long before we had a couple of big flinty stones each. I felt my way to the door. Charlie stationed himself to my left. "I'll try first, old man," I said. "Then it's your turn." I reached out and touched the right side of the door with an outstretched fist. That was one pace. I moved back another two, making sure I kept perpendicular to it. 2 or 3 deep breaths, then I dropped my right shoulder and charged. The crash as I connected was so loud they must have heard it in Tbilisi. I reeled. I felt like I'd been hit by a car. I took another 3 paces back, closed my eyes, and ran again. This time the door definitely moved. Charlie sprayed me with spit. "And again! Again! Come on! Get on with it!" 3 paces back, and bang! The door shifted a bit more, and I sank to the floor in pain. I rolled out of his way. "You go! You go!" A second later, as he crashed into it, the door folded in on itself. The hinges had given way before the bolt. I got up behind him, the pain masked for the time being by adrenaline, and we more or less fell into the undergrowth which lined the yard. 2 hurricane lamps jerked to and fro in the darkness as Harry and Kunzru bomb-burst out of the interrogation room. I started running at them, rocks clasped firmly in both hands, windmilling like a man possessed. I lost sight of Charlie as he went for the first one. The second got the contents of my left hand across his neck, or maybe his collarbone. He screamed out as the rock in my right crushed his gigs against his face. I scored another hit on the back of his shoulder as he followed it down to the mud. "Shit, Nick!" Charlie was in pain. He was lying next to a limp body, trying to get up off the ground, but his left leg wasn't helping. I shouted, "See if your one's got the keys! Keys! Money! Anything!"
I fumbled in the pockets of my one's leather jacket and found a wallet, picture ID, loose change and house keys. Charlie had more luck.
"I've got them!"
I picked up the lamp and cash and scrabbled around to find my boy's weapon. It was a revolver, well past its best before date. I jammed it into my jacket and ran over to Charlie. "Keys! Where are the keys?" I took them from him, hoisted his left arm around my shoulder and dragged him into the interrogation room. Charlie took in the bruise.
Stop! Stop!"
He poured them both into the empty thermos and we carried straight on out to the larder estate. I helped Charlie into the front right and eased myself behind the wheel. As we were doing a 25-point turn, I said, "What happened?"
"My ankle. I've twisted the fucking thing."
"We'll sort it. You get any money? Weapon?"
"Got both."
My foot hit the floor as soon as we reached the tarmac and the Speedo edged around the dial. Monday, the 2nd of May. The line of taxis outside the terminal hadn't moved much in the hour since first light. I had the trigger on the terminal entrance from the other side of the road. Charlie and I had come right into the lion's den, but there was no other way. Our only chance of retrieving the papers and tape was to get into the duty wagon, and there were 2 fixed points where we knew it would be during flying hours, at the camp and at the airport. I checked Baby G. It was just after 8. Charlie had hobbled into the terminal 10 minutes ago to get into position. He had to take the lead. I couldn't run the risk of being recognised. The idea was simple. The wagon turns up to drop off or pick up. Charlie sees it through the glass, walks out, lifts it at the point of his revolver, drives into the car park behind me. I jump in and we head for the border. If Bastard showed up first for an international flight, it would be one big bonus. Charlie lurched across the road like Long John Silver. He had a newspaper in his hand.
"Bastard's off to Vienna. We've got him."
He lobbed the paper in my direction.
"Here's the bad news."
He chucked me a copy of the Georgian Times, the English language paper. Most of the front page was covered by a grainy photograph of the yard in front of Baz's house. The banner headline screamed, "Saint Slain." It went on to bemoan the savage killing of the most honest and incorruptible public servant the country had ever seen. This wasn't the picture Bastard had painted, but that wasn't much of a surprise. The 2 other dead bodies found at Baz's house had been identified as members of the militant gang behind the recent school siege in Kazbegi. But who were the other 2 men caught on CCTV? One masked, one unmasked. Were they now in possession of the affidavit which the saint had been due to swear in front of the cameras for the news show 60 Minutes, exposing the rampant corruption in Georgian society? As Charlie got back to the terminal, a 2-tone Pajero, silver bottom, dark blue top, sped past the main doors, one up. I heard a door slam behind the buses, and Bastard was waddling towards the terminal, dressed in the US business uniform for the over-50s. He pulled a wheelie carry-on behind him. Whatever we had in those papers, it had got him all fired up. With a couple of tapes in the mix as well, he definitely needed to do the same as us. Just get the fuck out. I guessed he wasn't too anxious to land a starring role on 60 Minutes. Pulling my hat down low, I followed in step. "Oi, Bastendorf!" I gave him a happy face as I closed in, but stayed just beyond grabbing distance. "How the fuck do you know my—" "I've got Kunzru's weapon trained on you," I said. "I want our passports." "I burnt them." Over Bastard's shoulder I could see a 110 pull up in front of the terminal, its rear doors already opening. Charlie would be out any minute. He didn't know we could use the Pajero now, that there was now no need for desperate measures. All he had to do was bluff his way into the back and retrieve the gear. Maybe Bastard had the passports on him, maybe not. We'd soon find out. I nodded over his shoulder. "Turn round and head for the Land Rover. Move!" 2 guys stepped out of the 110, luggage in hand. Charlie would come out as soon as he saw them check in. "Go and tell the driver you were in the duty wagon a few days ago. Tell him you've lost something. I don't give a shit what you say, just pick up what's under the back seats." I pushed him forwards, eyes peeled for Charlie steaming through the terminal doors. If you say anything to the driver or start fucking about, I'll drop you. Understand? I've got nothing to lose." "Fuck you." Charlie emerged from the terminal. He was closing in on the driver's door when he pinged us. I shook my head, and he carried on hobbling. Bastard looked at me. "What I'm reaching for now is my wallet, okay?" I held back a metre or so as he approached the driver's window. He thrust his ID in the driver's face. Then he moved around to the rear doors. The driver turned and leaned across to help him lift the seats. Bastard emerged with the magazine in his hand and tapped a goodbye on the window. We turned and headed back the way we had come. I held out my hand for the magazine. Nobody talked as I drove the Pajero away from the airport perimeter. Bastard was next to me in the passenger seat. He knew I had a pistol tucked between my legs out of his reach and that Charlie had another behind him, but there was no knowing what he might do if he saw an opportunity to escape. I'd given Bastard a physical search when we got in, but he didn't have the passports on him. Charlie was emptying his carry-on across the back seat. I threw Charlie a map from the side pocket. He opened it out. "Looks like just over 200 k's to the Turkish border," he said. "I reckon the best route's south until we hit the pipeline, then follow it southwest." He finished checking the carry-on. "No mobile here either." Even doglegging it, we'd probably still get to the border well before last light, which would give us time to find a decent crossing point. I wasn't going to tell him yet, but Bastard was coming with us, as insurance. We were well out of the suburbs, up in the high ground, when the tarmac stopped abruptly and we hit a wide gravel track. As we wound down the side of the mountain, a wide, fast-flowing river sparkled in the sunlight below us. Bastard jerked his thumb at where the line of freshly turned earth cut back towards us and started to run level with the road. "There's your pipeline. They buried it. Makes it a whole lot tougher to blow up." Then the rain started. I flicked the wipers into overdrive, but still had to press my face against the windscreen to see where we were going. Bastard squinted through the curtain of water. "But who gives a shit? My job was just making sure things ran real smooth." "Fucked up there then, didn't you?" said Charlie, tapping the package in his jacket pocket. He'd wrapped the camcorder tape and the documents from Baz's safe in a plastic bag he'd found in Bastard's carry-on. Bastard gave a deep, frustrated sigh. "I'm not the decision-maker here. I'm like you guys. I'm a worker bee." "Worker bee my ass," I said. "You're a fucking maggot." I changed down to take a bend. "Remember Anthony, the Brit you slapped around at Waco?" He went quiet for a moment. "Anthony who? I don't remember slapping any Brit at Waco." "Yes, you do." My eyes were fixed on the mud-covered gravel ahead. The Pajero was starting to slip and slide, and I had to fight the wheel to correct it. "He designed the gas you used but shouldn't have, remember? He committed suicide about a year afterwards. He couldn't live with the guilt." "Oh, that Anthony. Fucking limey fag. He shouldn't have been there. Never send a boy to do a man's job." I braked hard, killed the ignition, and shoved Bastard towards the passenger door. "Get the fuck out, now!" I leant back against my door and kicked at him with both feet as he scrabbled for the handle. "I was there. I was with Anthony. I saw the whole fucking thing." I kicked him again as his door swung open and he slithered out into the mud. He picked himself off the ground, his face a mask of fear and indignation. "It wasn't me who gave the order. That was way above my pay scale." I followed him out whilst Charlie rummaged in the back of the wagon. I yelled through the rain, "None of those kids stood a chance, and you enjoyed every fucking minute." "Bingo!" Charlie gave me the thumbs up, slammed the rear door, and headed for the Pajero's bonnet. I brought my pistol up. Bastard backed away until he was pressing against the front wing. "Hey, I knew it was wrong to kill those people. Those were American citizens, my own people. Down, in the mud, now." He slid down the side of the vehicle and slumped against the wheel. The rain kicked up the puddles all around him. We were both soaked to the skin. My sleeve weighed heavily on my arm as I raised my pistol to his head. "Who are you working for? Who gave the order to drop Charlie? What's in those documents? What the fuck happened at the house?" Charlie had released the bonnet and was now standing on the other side of him. Bastard heaved air into his lungs and his face tilted up towards me, eyes screwed up against the rain. Charlie leant down and clipped one of the Pajero's jump leads onto the roll of fat above Bastard's collar. He held the second against his ear. Bastard screamed and collapsed like a rag doll, legs splayed out in the mud. The jump lead was still clamped to his neck. Charlie handed me the other and slid into the driver's seat. He fired up the ignition and gave the pedal a squeeze. I jammed my clip against the top of Bastard's ear. "This is very simple. You talk and I keep this away from you. Now, who the fuck are you working for?"
"The politicos, man. The guys Baz Gadzi was gunning for. That's why they wanted what was in the safe. That's all I know."
"You still with the Bureau? Is this some covert FBI fuckabout we've been sucked into here?" He shook his head.
"Those fuckers spat me out 4 years ago with just enough of an annuity to buy myself a cigar every 4th of July. Why'd you think I ended up in this goddamn shithole?"
I wasn't buying the sympathy card and brought the clip a fraction closer to let him know.
"I was in the job 30 years, and for what? Jack shit, man. So when these guys step in and offer me a retirement plan..."
"What happened at the house?"
"The guys I work for, there are 6 of them, okay? US dollars are flying in by the plane load, and a lot of them get diverted their way. They pay the militants to threaten the pipeline just to keep things on the boil. Nothing bad, nobody gets hurt. It's just good old-fashioned commerce. I'm just there..."
"Yeah, we know," said Charlie, "to smooth the way." I gave Bastard a kick. "Get on with it."
"This Baz Gadzi guy, he'd been getting more and more of a problem. The whole sainthood thing wasn't good for business, and neither was getting found out just before Bush arrives to rally the troops. So, the plan was steal the papers, find out what he knows, lean on the guy, warn him off."
He raised a hand to the jump lead still clamped onto his neck.
"Can I take this thing off? I'm fucking helping you here."
I shook my head. "You're helping yourself. That still doesn't explain what happened at the house or at the cemetery. Who were those guys?"
"Baz Gadzi wasn't any more popular with the militants than he was with my politicos. There's this fuck Akaki. He runs the militants, and if Baz Gadzi had proof he was on the take, he wanted him dead. This Akaki, he's a fucking psycho. That's not the way to deal with guys like Baz Gadzi. He's a fucking god around here. It's gotta be subtle."
"What, like you?" The rain was so hard it felt like a madman with a staple gun was attacking the back of my neck. Charlie pointed beyond the trees where mud and loose debris were breaking away from the side of the hill.
"We better start getting a move on. The road's taking a pounding."
I kicked Bastard to his feet. "Back in the car." Soon the curtain of water in front of us was so solid I had to slow the Pajero to a crawl. The noise was horrendous. Bastard glanced over his shoulder at Charlie, who seemed to be taking a snooze, and leaned towards me. "Nick, listen, what about you and me making a deal? Let me go with the papers and tape when we get to Bonjormi. I'll call my guys, see to it you're off the wanted list, and make everything cool once you two get into Turkey. We've had enough of this shit, don't you think?" He nodded at Charlie. "Just tell him I got out for a dump and made a run for it. Hey, how's he to know?" Brown slurry cascaded off the high ground to our left, carrying rocks and broken branches across our path. I glanced in the rear view. Charlie was wide awake and chuckling quietly. "You got a big problem with your plan, fat boy." He tapped the top pocket of his jacket. "And it's all in here." A second later, a river of mud 10 metres wide sluiced off the hill and hit the wagon broadside, pushing us to where the road fell away to the river below. I swung the wheel to steer us into the skid, but nothing happened. "Charlie, out the wagon!" The mudslide gathered weight and momentum and started to spill in through the open windows. I grabbed the edge of the roof and hauled myself out of the gap.
Bastard was sliding his fat ass towards the passenger door. He could look after himself. The Pajero was beginning to tip. I wrestled open the rear door and dragged Charlie clear by the shoulders. He tumbled out on top of me as the vehicle slewed another couple of metres, then finally succumbed to the sheer weight of mud and cartwheeled down towards the river. Charlie looked at me. "We better not hang about, lad. Doubt we'll make the border before tomorrow in this shit. So, first stop Bonjormi, hit the local Hertz kiosk and crack on, eh?" I nodded. 4 or 5 hours, maybe, even with you in Hopalong Cassidy mode. I grabbed Bastard by the scruff of his neck. "I'll grip him. You just keep that ankle moving." Charlie set off, and I manhandled Bastard. We kept on the road, or what we could see of it. Large cracks had opened across it, and water sluiced through them like they were storm drains. For 2 hours I pushed and shoved Bastard. It couldn't have been easy shifting that bulk of his. I could almost hear those big wobbly thighs of his chafing together with every step he took. We were still following the pipeline scar to the left of the road. The rain was a solid grey curtain. Then, as we rounded a sweeping bend into high ground, I saw a splash of white about 150 metres ahead of us. As we got closer, the white blur became a Mercedes van, up to its axles in the mud. Both sets of rear wheels were spinning. I dodged the spray and made my way round the passenger side and tapped on the glass. The figure in the passenger seat spun around, clearly startled. I could see her dark eyes, as wide as saucers, through the rain-blurred window. She stared at me for several seconds, then switched her gaze to Charlie and Bastard as they closed up behind me. I could understand her concern. We were in the middle of nowhere in a torrential storm. We must have looked as though we'd just crawled out of a primeval swamp. I unzipped my jacket, lifted it up, and turned from side to side. "No weapons," I mouthed. I let my jacket fall as the others followed suit. She wound the window down about 6 inches. "Speak English," I said. She turned to the driver, said something in rapid-fire paperclip, and faced me again. I spoke very slowly. "Our car. It got hit. The mud." Bastard appeared at my shoulder and pushed me aside. He pulled his accreditation from his soaked leather wallet and thrust it through the gap. "We want to get to Bonjormi. See that ID? That says you take us." The two inside the Mercedes had another exchange in paperclip, and the woman shrugged and passed the ID back. "Sure," she said. "It's no more than 30 minutes. We're going there ourselves. You'll have to dig us out first, though." The driver climbed out. He was tall and lanky, maybe mid-20s. He came round the front of the vehicle and thrust out a hand. "I'm Pater. She's Nana." Charlie and I introduced ourselves, then Charlie bent to inspect the axle. "Spinning the wheels only drives them deeper." He went round to the front, opened the passenger door, and emerged with the rubber mat from the footwell. He handed it to me. "You might be able to scrape enough mud away from the wheels with this to get some traction, lad." He turned back to Pater. "What about snow chains?" Pater slid open the side door and reappeared with 2 sets. Charlie dropped one into each of the furrows I'd scooped behind the tyres and threw in the rubber mat for good measure. At Charlie's signal, Nana revved the engine and dropped the clutch. The wheels spun for a second, and the Merc rolled straight out of the ruts and back onto firmer ground. Nana climbed out. She was dressed in walking boots, waterproof trousers, and an expensive black Gore-Tex jacket. Her features were almost elfin, but there was nothing fluffy about her demeanour. She gave the side door a quick tap, and it slid open to reveal a bank of TV monitors and a man with a huge beard and biceps the size of Bastard's thighs. "This is Koba," said Nana. "He makes sure we come to no harm." Koba studied us with dark, hooded eyes, as if trying to decide which of us to head-butt first. "There's only room for another 3 of us here in the back." Nana pointed at Charlie. "Why don't you get in the front with Pater and stretch out your leg? It looks painful." Bastard heaved himself inside, and I followed. It was obviously an outside broadcast setup. I'd thought Nana seemed familiar. Now I remembered. She'd fronted the camera in the TV newscast I'd seen at the airport. We set off. The soundproofing in the cab did a perfect job of muting the rain.
"Now, where the fuck's some coffee?"
said Bastard. Nana reached into one of the large nylon zip bags on the floor and handed him a stainless steel thermos.
"Do you guys work on the pipeline?" she said. "What are you, surveyors, engineers?"
Bastard poured himself a generous mug.
"Security."
She turned to me.
"You security too? Do you have any ID? Koba likes to be sure about people."
I did my best to look apologetic. "It was in my bag, in our Pajero. We lost everything." She switched her attention back to Bastard.
"We're planning a documentary about the pipeline. Maybe we could do business one day." "Anti, I guess," he said. "Well, don't you think it's crazy for an oil pipeline to cut straight through a national park?"
Bastard took a deep breath.
"Listen, lady, it had to come this way to avoid the Russians down south. Hey, it's you people who call them the aggressive neighbor, not us."
I jumped in to try to stop things escalating. "And you, Nana, why are you going to bonjour me?" Her eyes narrowed. I knew she didn't like me. I just hoped I didn't know the reason why.
"You probably won't have heard, but just over a week ago, militants massacred more than 60 women and children in a village called Kazbegi. A farming family in Borjormi lost their only child in the massacre, a little girl. She was 7 years old."
She paused.
"We were with them on Saturday. We're going back because they're willing to go live and tell us what it's like to live under the tyranny of Akaki, the militant leader. He's no freedom fighter. He's a self-seeking, dictatorial thug. These poor people live in fear. But this couple, well, they've had enough."
"That Akaki," said Bastard. "Boy, he's caused us all a few headaches over the years."
"Headaches?" she said. "I suppose you could call them that. Did you hear of the murder of Zurab Bazgadzi?"
She was talking to him, but I had a nasty feeling she was addressing me.
"Zurab, eh?" said Bastard. "He a friend of yours, missy?" "He became so. He was here on Saturday visiting the bereaved family. He was very good like that, a man of the people. We were to film him at length on Sunday morning, but he had to return to Tbilisi at short notice, so we were only able to grab a few minutes with him."
I thought I could see tears in her eyes.
"Now, of course, I wish we'd tried harder to persuade him to stay." "Hey, lady," said Bastard, "what more did that fucking saint of yours want from us? We're bankrolling you. We're giving you independence, freedom, and stability. And in exchange for what? A few miles of metal tube."
Seconds later, we pulled up in front of a huge barn. Pater jumped out to open the doors, and we drove a dozen or so metres into the centre. It was completely empty. All I could see was a roughly hewn wooden bench in the far corner by the remains of a small fire. Nana said something in paperclip to Koba. He nodded and unzipped his jacket as Bastard fell out of the wagon. "Thanks for the lift," I said. "Now we've got to get going."
"Edward, the farmer," said Nana. "He'll know if there's transport. I'll call him."
She punched the buttons on her cell phone. A peasant Georgian farmer with a mobile? Nana's eyes were glued to Koba, and the look between them told me everything. She knew. She'd known all along. I walked over to Charlie. "Come on, mate," I murmured. "We're off." As we took a pace towards the doors, Koba took a pace towards us. It had gone noisy. I charged at him, head down. Nana screamed, but Koba's hand moved faster. A split second later, I was staring down a shiny chrome barrel 3 metres from my face. He covered all three of us, the twitch of the .357 Magnum Desert Eagle's muzzle making it clear that our next sensible move was to get down in the dirt. We got down. I looked at Nana. She flashed beams of hatred at me as she waffled away in paperclip. I heard Baz's name mentioned a few times before she closed the cell down. "The police are coming," she said. She knelt down by my head.
Do you think I didn't recognize you? You killed Zurab. I don't just make the news, I watch it too.
Stupid wasn't going to work. Yes, we were there, Nana, Charlie and I, but we didn't kill him. Akaki did. They were his people. She stared at me coldly.
So what? Akaki got there a little earlier. You all wanted him dead. Why else were you there? And this one, she aimed a toe at Bastard's head, he carries government ID. What am I to make of that?
Pater was busy setting up his camera stand and lights just a few meters from us. This was it then, our big moment, captured on camera. I wondered what Silky and Hazel would make of it. Nana stood up, hit the keys again, and waffled into the cell. Meanwhile, Pater fired up the Merc's onboard generator and the arc lights burst into life. Then he knelt by the van to unpack a satellite dish. Nana's exclusive would be going out live, with us pleading our innocence straight to camera just before the police arrived. As Nana finished her conversation, Charlie said, "Nana, we didn't do it. We can prove it. We have papers. That affidavit everyone's after, I've got it here." He turned to Bastard. "And a tape of this fat fuck setting the whole thing up." 2 minutes later, our tape started to spin in the console. By now, Koba had the three of us lying down beside the Merc's open door, but we had a pretty good view of one of the monitors. It was unmistakably Jim Bastendorf coming into Charlie's hotel room at the Marriott. We all listened to Bastard telling Charlie the reason he needed him to get into the house on Saturday night.
"The fuck's away until Sunday, so it's gotta be Saturday night. You got it?"
Nana, who'd been flicking through Baz's papers, looked across at me.
"Do you know what this says?"
As I shook my head, I watched a tear fall from her cheek and land on the page. Her hand reached out and touched Pater's back.
"We must go live with this, right now."
We watched as Pater rigged up the sat dish just outside the barn doors. The screens flickered. A woman in a blue jacket materialised in front of us, sitting at a desk in an empty studio. She pulled on her set of headphones, and the speakers crackled.
"Nana? Nana?"
Nana cut the sound, pulled on her own set of earphones and mic, and started talking in low, urgent tones. Baz's name came up again and again, as she looked down and quoted chunks from the document. The woman in the studio looked horrified. When she reached the bottom of the last page, she closed the folder and exchanged a word or two with her colleague in the studio. Nana's eyes were still full as she removed her headphones.
"We planned to film Zurab presenting this document to us in front of his government colleagues, the very men he was going to expose. But none of us had any idea these revelations would be so abominable."
I didn't know what to say. How could I? I hadn't a clue what it was she'd just been reading. But we had to try to convince her before the uniforms arrived.
"Nana, why would we give you this stuff? We've told you what happened. All we were there for was the papers. If we were part of it, why would we tape this fat bastard?"
At that moment, we all heard the noise from outside.
"The police,"
said Nana. But a second later, Pater came running back into the barn, screaming in paperclip. I picked up only one word, and it wasn't good news. The scream of engines got louder. 3 or 4 wagon loads of militants, by the sound of it. Charlie was the first to see them.
"Taliban wagons."
Guys in black masks and green combat jackets, some with ponchos, swarmed out of Toyota pickups laden with AKs, light machine guns, and belts of 7.62 short. Koba ran straight for them, screaming, going ballistic. I leapt up and grabbed Charlie. "Let's go, go, go!" The heavy-caliber .357 kicked in Koba's hands. I heard screams from both sides of the barn doors. Charlie and I ducked down behind the van. Bastard materialised behind us as 2 bursts of AK put an end to the Desert Eagle. I looked under the van. Koba was writhing in the mud, blood pumping from his torso. A big guy with wild hair and an Osama-style beard walked across to him, the butt of an AK in his poncho-draped shoulder. He leaned in and squeezed the trigger. Koba's head exploded like a melon. Nana had balls, that was for sure. She was straight over to confront Akaki, treating him to a blur of hands and paperclip as she pointed to the satellite dish, the van, the arc lights, the camera. I didn't get to see her whole performance. Another wagon load had swarmed round our side of the Merc and were using their boots and rifle butts to corral us in the corner of the barn towards the bench. Nana was getting nowhere with Akaki. He swept Nana to one side and strode into the barn. 2 blood-stained corpses were dragged before him. The farmer and his wife had had their interview. Bastard jumped to his feet and brushed aside a couple of militants who weren't quick enough to step out of his way.
"Akaki, you miserable fuck!"
Akaki pulled his rain-soaked poncho over his head to reveal a pair of Levi 501s and a US battle-dress jacket. He'd shoved some sort of semi-automatic into his shoulder holster and 4 extra AK mags in his chest harness. He didn't even blink as Bastard approached, just raised a hand to calm anyone shaping up to blow holes in him. They knew each other all right.
"You!"
Bastard's finger jabbed in Nana's direction.
"Fucking Barbara Walters! Give him those papers!"
The Merc's suspension groaned as he disappeared through the side door. Akaki ripped Baz's papers from Nana's outstretched hand. She kept talking, but he was in no mood to listen. He lashed out with his fist. She took the punch square on the cheek and crumpled to the floor. Bastard reappeared. I saw the outline of the Marriott cassette in his wet jacket pocket. He turned towards us.
"You 2 fucks really think I was coming all the way with you?"
He came and stood inches from my face.
"You know what? I should have gone to the cemetery and done the job myself, instead of hiring a moron with a machete to make a king-size fuck-up."
He spotted Koba's weapon and hooked it out of its proud new owner's belt. I looked him straight in the eye as he closed one hand on the grip and brought the other one up for good measure. Nana screamed Pater's name, but she needn't have bothered. Akaki roared an order, and Bastard got an AK butt on the side of the head before he even saw it coming. The militant leader stormed across and started yelling at Bastard, punctuating every sentence with a good kick to the American's prostrate bulk. Nana translated.
"He says you can take the farmer's car. If you don't go now, he'll kill you."
Bastard reached the farmer's corpse on his hands and knees and delved into the blood-stained pockets like a starving man fighting for food. A set of keys glinted in Pater's arc lights, and he staggered to his feet. Akaki grabbed him by the roll of fat above his collar and frog-marched him all the way to the door. Then he returned to Nana, pummeling her shoulder as he let her know what was on his mind. Pater kept a watchful eye on the AKs just inches away from them as he translated.
"He wants an interview right here and now. He has an important message for his fellow Georgians and wants his words to be recorded for posterity."
Nana seemed to be arguing, and I was worried for her.
"Why don't you guys just give him what he wants? What's she giving him a hard time about?" "She's telling him it's a great idea, but we should go and film him in the village. He needs to be seen out in the open, amongst his people, not cowering in a cattle shed. She'll do the edit when she's back in Tbilisi."
"Yeah, right. I bet he's really buying into that."
"She has to try."
He cocked his head. He'd heard something he didn't like.
"Oh, shit. He's talking about the dish. He knows we can go out live."
Now Nana was turning away. She knew when to concede. Akaki gave her a parting kick in the small of the back to help her on her way. She limped the remaining 5 or 6 paces to the bench.
"Here's the deal. We go live or he kills us all now. He wants to sit right here on the bench and address not just his fellow Georgians, but the USA too."
Her eyes bored into Pater.
"Go and fix up the link. Tell them who we have."
She looked him in the eye.
"We need the cavalry. Understand?"
She turned to us.
"Charlie and Nick, help me with the camera and lights."
Akaki sat, smoked and brooded as we helped Nana lug the camera and lighting gear over to the bench. Several AK muzzles tracked our every move. It wasn't long before everything was rigged. Akaki groomed his beard with a gap-toothed plastic comb, preparing himself for TV stardom. Nana stuck in an earpiece and plugged it into the camera. Then she moved to his side and murmured quietly in his ear. As he started bellowing, ponchos went back on and AKs were shouldered. Nana came back over to us.
I've told him that if this is to go out live to the US, series of links to camera in English. I've also suggested he send some men to scout exterior locations and round up enough locals for a crowd scene. We're going to meet them at the village hall once we've closed down the link.
3 of the tallywagons were already firing up as the guys clambered aboard. A second later, they went charging up the track. Akaki was just keeping 2 arse-lickers behind. They stood a few metres away, AKs trained on Charlie and me. Charlie put an avuncular hand on Nana's shoulder. "Well done, lass." She smiled briefly, then was back in control.
Nick, Charlie, get in the van. I don't want him to see your faces when I go live.
As we made our way to the Merc, the lights burst into life. Pater sat hunched just in front of us, one earphone on, the other high on his head.
5 seconds, said Pater. Yes, they're airborne. String it out.
I caught Charlie's eye as the countdown crackled in Nana's earpiece.
2, 1, on air.
Standing right here next to me, she turned to Akaki and gave him a deep, respectful bow, is a disgrace to mankind, the most despicable gangster ever to walk the blessed earth of Georgia. He nodded his acknowledgement, then stared back into the camera. And within the last few minutes, I've seen documentary evidence of his most appalling act of treachery to date, an abominable act. Akaki nodded his appreciation. Nana smiled and nodded back. An affidavit was to have been sworn today by a member of Parliament, whose name I can't mention because this monster beside me will recognize it, but tragically he can't do that now. He's dead, murdered by Akaki's men. Akaki now has possession of this document, but I've read it from cover to cover, and I can never forget the awfulness of what I've read. Pater muttered an acknowledgement to somebody into his mic and pressed a button.
5 minutes, Nana. Keep going.
She put a finger to her earpiece and nodded.
The representative in question, known as a man dedicated to fighting the corruption that stains our country, was murdered because he had proof that 6 members of our government are implicated in terrorist activities, in concert with the man you see before you.
Charlie touched Pater's shoulder. This isn't actually going to the States, is it? He shook his head without looking round. Nana turned to Akaki and somehow managed to smile.
This monster was paid $1 million American by these politicians to plan and carry out the massacre of 60 women and children last month in the village of Kazbegi.
Akaki's head jerked round. He'd smelled a rat.
I'm now going to expose those murdering and corrupt politicians to the people of Georgia.
Her eyes flickered to the sky. I hadn't heard anything inside the van, but the arse-lickers had. They ran outside and stared into the clouds. As Nana began reciting the names, Akaki swept the camera aside and charged through the barn doors. The Hueys were virtually overhead. The arse-lickers tumbled into their tallywaggon. Akaki tried to bring his AK into his shoulder, only to be buffeted by the downwash. The tallywaggon screamed to a halt alongside him, and the arse-lickers pulled him aboard. The heli dipped its nose and headed for the field just to the side of the barn. I looked through the slats. 4 Hueys were touching down in the field 100 metres away. BDU-clad bodies leapt out and took up fire positions. Pater was out of the van, dragging the camera from its mount, ripping out all the leads. He extended the small antenna that would maintain the link with the satellite dish and keep the feed live. There was the rattle of automatic gunfire from the high ground to our right. Akaki's crew were putting down fire from the village. Pater rushed outside, camera on his shoulder, Nana by his side. I grabbed Charlie and we skirted round the side of the barn. We scrambled up to the tree line using the building as cover and then turned back towards the village, paralleling the road. We had a bird's-eye view of the chaos below us. BDUs milled around in the field. A tractor and an old larder sat abandoned at the side of the track, but nothing that looked as though it might get our soaked arses out of here at any sort of speed, even if we could have dodged the militants to our right and half the Georgian army down below us to our left.
Fuck it, let's go.
Charlie slid downhill and broke free of the tree line. I followed. He was making for a cluster of small wooden houses that hugged the main drag. We edged into an unfenced yard and flattened ourselves against the back wall. Squaddies at the bottom of the road loosed off with their AKs. From higher up to our right, Akaki's men gave it back in spades. The barrels of their guns must have been red hot. A round ricocheted off the wall beside us and screamed up into the air. I tugged Charlie's sleeve. "Wait here, old one." Keeping low, I moved to the corner of the house. Lying on my stomach, I inched my way along the wall until I could see up and down the road. It was deserted. The villagers were keeping well out of this. I didn't blame them a bit. The road stumbled uphill for about 100 metres before disappearing. The militants' fire position must have been just beyond the bend. They'd chosen well. They had a clear line of fire all the way down into the valley where the helis had landed. I made my way back to Charlie. He had his leg elevated against the back wall, rain falling onto his face. "The squaddies are getting close." I held out a hand. He grabbed it and I pulled him up. "I didn't see Akaki's crew. They must be past the bend, 100 up. We need to get up there and beyond their line. We'll stay behind the houses."
Well done, lad. So what are we hanging about for?
I hooked his arm over my shoulder and we started to pick our way through a succession of unfenced backyards. Finally, I stopped, head up. "Listen." Firing had come from behind us. We were beyond the contact. All we had to do now was drop down into the village and see about hot-wiring ourselves some freedom. We emerged beside what looked like the village hall.
"Our carriage awaits, lad,"
said Charlie. A tally wagon sat just 30 metres away in the middle of the road. I started running without checking he was behind me. There was no movement, but the village was far from deserted. Shouts and a burst of automatic blazed from the other side of some buildings. I headed for the driver's side and flung open the door. No keys. I rummaged around in the glove compartment, the footwell, the door pockets. They were under the seat. I jumped in and hit the ignition. Then I heard a shout to my right, and it wasn't Charlie. An Akaki look-alike was sheltering in a doorway no more than 3 metres away. His RPK swung up almost in slow motion. He was looking beyond me. I shouted, "Charlie!" There was a blur of bodies and muzzle flash. The gun jerked and sprayed a short burst into the air, then weapon and owner disappeared under Charlie's flailing body. I leapt out and took a running kick at the militant's head. My boot connected. Charlie rolled to one side and grabbed the weapon. "His mags, Nick! Get his mags!" The RPK was basically an AK-47 with a longer barrel and a folding bipod under the muzzle. It could be fed from the AK-30 round mags, and the boy had 2 of them in a chest harness. I pulled them free, and we both legged it into the wagon. I threw it into 4-wheel and headed downhill. We came out into the main drag like a cork from a bottle. The other tally wagons had pulled in before the bend about 200 metres ahead of us. I braked to a halt and shoved the wagon into first. "It's one pass," I said. "Make the most of it." Charlie poked the weapon out of his window, wooden stock resting on the door, butt into his shoulder. I accelerated. Seconds later, we were level with Akaki's crew, and Charlie fired short, sharp bursts into anything that moved. "Stop!" he yelled. "Stop!" I hit the brake, and Charlie took aim at a wagon containing 3 men, one of whom, unmistakably, was Akaki. The wagon lurched forward and sped back the way we'd come. I threw our Toyota into a 3-point turn. As we closed, their rear screen disintegrated and our windscreen took 2 rounds. Charlie shoved the RPK's muzzle through the hole. Its barrel sizzled in the rain. Another burst. Akaki's wagon crashed straight into the side of the village hall. One body jumped out of the back, another fell. The driver stayed put, slumped over the wheel. Ramming the gear shift into first, I aimed at the body running along the edge of the square. Charlie worked frantically to change mags as we bounced and shuddered towards the runner. No mistaking who it was. Charlie brought up his weapon and fired. Akaki went down. Charlie shouted over the windrush, "One down, one to go!" It suddenly dawned on me he was enjoying this. It wasn't only to get Bastard. This was the last chance he'd ever have to do some soldiering, the thing he was born for. We were only 10 minutes out of the village when our headlights picked out a static vehicle at the roadside, a rusting lime-green Lada. The bonnet was up. "Thank you, God," said Charlie. He reached down and pulled the RPK from the footwell. I stopped the Toyota and he climbed out. "Stay here. I'll check for sign." He hobbled forward, RPK at the ready. He circled the car, checking the mud for tracks, then came back. "Flat shoes, leading into the tree line. He can't have gone far. We got the fucker." He hobbled off without waiting to see if I was coming. I grabbed the keys and got out. I followed him straight into the trees and started climbing. Almost immediately, Charlie froze, reacting to a rustling noise in the dead ground ahead of him. There was a shout. "Fuck you!" Then a heavy caliber shot and a falling body. Charlie was down. I ran into the dip. Bastard. I could see him pushing deeper into the pines. I grabbed the RPK and squeezed off a series of short, sharp bursts. Bastard went down. Weapon in the shoulder, I moved towards him. He saw me coming. He curled on his side. Dark, deoxygenated blood oozed from his gut and ran down the Desert Eagle in his belt. I was only a couple of meters away when he held up a hand.
"Nick, I'll split my $500,000 with you. Chuck got his $500,000.
I just let him fill the gaps.
"I'm sorry about the cemetery thing, but I'd taken half his cash, man. I had to tidy up. Loose ends."
I heard the rattle of heli rotors in the distance.
"Hey, Nick, tell you what. Get me back to Istanbul. I'll give you it all. I'll even give you the tape back. You're no fool, Nick. You know it's a good deal. Think about it. Chuck's gone. You gotta think of yourself now."
This guy never gave up, did he? I raised the RPK. "Don't call him Chuck." I watched his face relax. "Fuck you." His hand dropped and went for Koba's weapon. I pulled the trigger. The farm, 3 weeks later. It had been a simple funeral. Hazel and Julie had thrown themselves into organising every detail. I guessed it held the demons at bay for just a little bit longer. There'd been no priest in charge and no formal prayers. We all just stood round the coffin next to the hole, and everybody said their piece. Then we lowered him into the ground, Hazel and Julie on one set of ropes, Alan and me on the other. Silky was in charge of music. A couple of Charlie's favourite ABBA songs blared out from the camper van nearby. Later that night, while Alan and Hazel were putting the kids to bed, I sat with Silky, watching images float across the TV screen, picking up the odd sentence here and there. It was current affairs time. President Bush had stopped by in Georgia on his way back from the VE celebrations in Moscow. The event had been covered for CNN by a local reporter, Emmy-nominated Nana Anani. A week later, at last light with the sun really low, the VW was outside the house, all packed, ready to go. Well, sort of. The surfboard only had 2 bungees holding it down. Silky came out onto the veranda, arm in arm with Julie. She came down the steps, gave Hazel a final hug, and jumped into the VW. Hazel kept her hand on my arm and pulled back to have a last look at me. "Something stopped him coming home," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't try hard enough to persuade him." She smiled at me. "I knew the silly bugger wanted to die with his boots on. Oh, and Nick, remember to thank Crazy Dave for what he's done for us. The money, getting you 2 back here. He's been absolutely wonderful." I kissed her cheek. "He has, hasn't he?" Mother and daughter waved to us from the veranda as we turned down the track. I leant forward on the steering wheel, ready for a long night's drive, thinking about my best mate, Crazy Dave. I'd heaved Charlie into the tallywaggon and followed the pipeline as we'd planned, driving all night without lights so the hellies didn't see me. From that moment on, Crazy Dave had taken over. He got us picked up on the Georgian side of the border and driven into Turkey. He sorted passports, everything. He'd got us flown back to Australia, me in club class and Charlie in cargo, and then he'd seen to it that Hazel was set up for life. But then he hadn't had a whole lot of choice. As I'd crawled along beside the pipeline that night, I'd mulled over what the fat fuck had said. Bastard's Politico mates had given him $1 million for the job, but instead of spreading it around, he'd skimmed off 500 grand for his retirement plan. Crazy Dave hadn't been far behind. Charlie had only needed 200,000, and the silly fucker had probably said he'd do anything for it. So I made a deal with Mr. Good Guy of Bobblestock while waiting in the club lounge at Istanbul. He'd give Hazel the whole $500,000, saying it was the agreed fee. In return, I'd hold off telling the guys who knocked on his door how much markup he liked to take. The bit I'd enjoyed most was telling him that if he didn't have the cash in Hazel's account by the time I arrived in Brisbane, I'd be on the next flight to come and separate his bony arse from his wheelchair. Silky touched my arm. "By the smile, Nick Stein?" I took my eyes off the track for a second and grinned at her. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how right you were. We are a good fit, aren't we?" She laughed and leaned her head against my shoulder, and if that was what joining the human race was all about, I was up for it.